The banker slammed the foreclosure notice onto the counter so hard that the inkwell rattled. "Sign it," he said, not even looking up. "Crowther's dead. Ranch is done. And frankly, it should have been taken 2 years ago." The woman standing across from him didn't flinch. She was heavy-set, plain-dressed, with calloused hands wrapped around a leather satchel that held every dollar she had left in the world. The banker finally looked at her, really looked at her, and laughed. Not cruelly, almost worse, dismissively, like she was a problem that would solve itself. "Ma'am, you cannot run that land alone." She placed her money on the counter. Every coin, every folded bill. "Watch me," she said quietly, and she walked out into the cold. If that had been you, every dollar gone, a dead man's name on your lips, a whole town doubting you, would you have walked back in and fought? Or would you have let the door close behind you and never looked back? Before we go any further, if stories like this one reach something deemed something about survival and second chances and the kind of quiet courage most people never get credit for subscribed to this channel right now, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because stories like Lenora's deserve to go everywhere. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Silas Crowther had not planned to come home. That was the truth of it, and it shamed him some, though shame was a luxury a man couldn't afford when he was limping down a mountain pass with a leg that had been broken badly and set worse. Leaning on a walking stick, he'd carved himself from a dead pine branch somewhere above the timberline. He had been gone 27 months. He knew the number exactly because he had carved a mark into the wall of the trapper's cabin where he'd spent the worst of that second winter, a sing-sousum for each week, grouped in fours like prisoners do, like a man counting his sentence. 59 marks. He'd stopped adding them in spring when he finally accepted that counting wasn't helping him get anywhere. What had kept him alive was not hope. He was honest enough with himself to know that much. Hope had burned out somewhere around month 4, when the herd was gone and his leg had shattered under a spooked horse on a frozen creek bed, and he'd dragged himself to shelter through 20 yards of snow on his elbows, well, biting through the inside of his cheek hard enough to draw blood just to stay conscious. What had kept him alive after that was something simpler and uglier: stubbornness. The dumb animal refusal to stop moving. The drovers who'd hired him were long scattered, half probably dead themselves. The drive north had been Callum Pruitt's idea, good money, Pruitt said, better than anything the basin ranchers could offer, and the cattle market up in Harwick territory was hungry. Silas had needed that money badly. Evelyn was already gone by then. She'd been gone 4 months when he signed on, and the ranch had been bleeding debt since the drain cytrumfer before her sickness, and the grief was a thing he could not sit still inside of. Moving had seemed better than staying. Movement had seemed like a plan. It had not been a plan. It had been running away dressed up as necessity, and by the time the blizzards hit and the herd began dying, and men began dying with them, Silas had understood that. But understanding something doesn't help you much when the temperature is 30 below and your leg is knitting wrong and you are 4 days from anywhere. So he survived. Ugly and slow and without grace, he survived. And now he was limping back through the brown grass of Redwillow Basin in late October with nothing but the clothes he was wearing, a bed roll borrowed from a family near Tenshaw who'd taken pity on him, and the deed to a ranch he was almost certain the bank had taken months ago. He wasn't even sure why he was going back. Some things a man does not choose so much as they just happen to him, gravity, mostly. He had come from that land. He was going back to it. What he found when he got there would be what he found. He expected a locked gate and a bank notice nailed to the post. He expected overgrown fields and broken fences and that particular silence that settles over a property when no one has breathed life into it for a long time. He did not expect smoke. He was still a quarter-mile out when he smelled it wood smoke, steady and deliberate. Not the accidental smoke of something burning, but the purposeful smoke of a fire that had been built and tended and fed. Stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the trail with his hand tightening around his walking stick, and he stared at the rise ahead of him where his house sat. Smoke rising from his chimney. He stood there long enough that a hawk circled overhead twice, patient in the way birds are when they have spotted something confused and still on the ground below. He started walking again. faster, though his leg protested it. His jaw had gone tight. The gate was closed but not locked. Pushed it open. The hinges didn't squeal the way they used to. They'd been oiled recently. He noticed that before he'd even fully registered it as something to notice. Then he looked at the fence line and stopped again. The fence was repaired, not patched repaired. New posts where the old ones had rotted through. Wire strung tight and even. It was good, careful work, the kind that takes time and judgment, not just muscle. He walked up the track toward the house. The fields to his left had been turned under and were resting for winter, but he could see the evidence of crops, harvested the cut stalks, the furrow lines still clean and deliberate, the kind of order a field has when someone has worked it with real intention. In the corral to his right, 6 cattle stood. Healthy, heavy-bodied, most of them the kind of weight that said they'd been well grazed and watered all season. His cattle had been 63 head when he left. He had no idea where these 6 had come from or what had happened to the rest, but they were fat and calm, and they turned their faces toward him without alarm, the way animals do, around people they trust. Silas stood at the corral fence and gripped the rail with his free hand and tried to understand what he was seeing. Could not understand it. The front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch. She was not a small woman. She was broad-shouldered and full-figured, with the kind of solid, heavy-set build that speaks of hard physical work sustained over years. Her hair was dark going gray at the temples, pulled back from a face that was weathered and plain and, at this moment, utterly unguarded, the expression of a person who has been completely alone for a very long time and has just heard something unexpected. She was wiping her hands on her apron, and looking at him the way people look at something that doesn't fit the world they've arranged in their head. She did not speak first. Silas did. "This is Redwillow Ranch," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. 27 months had done something to it. Silas Crowther's land. The woman's hands went still against her apron. I'm Silas Crowther," he said. The color left her face so completely and so fast that he thought for a moment she was going to faint. She grabbed the porch post with one hand. Her knuckles went white around it. She stared at him for a long time. "You're dead," she said. The words came out flat and certain, the way people say things they know are true. "Evidently not," Silas said. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, not fear exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, something complicated. She was calculating, he realized. Running through its windows were rapidly, running through things in her head. A person does when the world has just rearranged itself beneath their feet and they are trying to find solid ground. "My name is Lenora Quill," she said finally. Her voice was steadier than her face. She stopped. Started again. "I've been working this land. I can see that," Silas said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Silas was looking at her and trying to place her. The name Quill meant something distant and blurred the way a name does when you've heard it in passing years ago and filed it nowhere important. He could not attach a face to it. He could not attach a story. She was a stranger, standing on his porch in front of the house that smelled of wood smoke and appeared to be in better condition than when he'd left it, which was more disorienting than he wanted to admit. "You'd better come inside," Lenora said. It was not warm the way she said it. It was not cold either. It was careful. He followed her in. The interior of the house stopped him in the doorway. He had expected he didn't know what he'd expected. Bare floors, maybe. Someone else's furniture. Signs of careless occupancy, the kind a squatter leaves behind. He had expected to feel like a stranger in his own house. Instead, he felt something harder to name. The room was clean. The furniture was his, or most of it rearranged slightly, with care taken. On the shelf near the window, his wife Evelyn's small ceramic pitcher was still there. The blue one she'd carried from her mother's house and treated like something sacred. It had not been moved. It had been dusted. There was a pot on the stove that smelled like venison stew. There was a fire in the hearth that was burning at exactly the right depth for a cold night. The way you learn to build a fire only after you've maintained one alone for a long time. Silas sat down at the table because his leg was done with standing. He put his walking stick against the chair and looked at his hands for a moment because they were easier to look at than the room. "You've been here the whole time?" he asked. Lenora set 2 cups on the table and poured coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the stove. She did it without asking if he wanted any, which told him something: she was a practical woman, not a performative one. Almost 2 years, she said. She sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him directly. The bank was going to foreclose. They had the paperwork ready. I talked them into letting me take on the note instead. Silas looked at her. Why, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. She was quiet for a moment. She was turning something over in her head, deciding how much to say and in what order. Do you remember a woman in Tenshaw? About 7 years ago. Winter. She had a debt she couldn't pay and a woodpile that wasn't going to last the month. Silas said nothing. He was watching her face. She had a husband who died of fever the previous spring, Lenora continued. She had about $14 to her name, and a creditor who was done waiting. Someone paid what she owed. Left no name. The woman who ran the general store told her it was a passing traveler who'd heard the situation and settled it, no strings attached. Except Lenora paused. Except apparently he did say one thing. Silas had very still. Something was moving in his memory. Far back. Faint. He said someday, if she was able, she should do the same for someone else who needed it. The memory surfaced. Not complete, not vivid. More like the shape of something: a cold morning. A store counter. A story he'd heard by accident about a widow 2 streets over who was about to lose everything a week before the first hard freeze. He had not known her. He had barely thought about it afterward. It had cost him some money that he'd had at the time and hadn't replaced for a while, but he'd had it, which meant he was the one who could do it, and so he had. He had not thought about it since. That was you, he said. That was me, Lenora said. She held his gaze without flinching. There was something exhausted in her face. He realized not the exhaustion of one bad night, but the kind that builds across months of relentless work. The kind that has become so familiar the person wearing it has stopped noticing it themselves. I heard Crowther's ranch was going under, she said. Heard the man who owned it had died out on the trail somewhere. I didn't have much, but I had enough to make an arrangement with the bank. She looked down at her cup. Seemed right. Silas sat with that. He was a man who had spent 27 months with very little to do but think, and he was still finding himself unable to fully catch up with what was sitting across from him. You did this alone, he said. Mostly, she said. A couple of men from town helped with the heavy fence work in spring. Paid them what I could. She shrugged. One shoulder. The gesture of someone who does not like to make much of themselves. You work with what you have. You plowed those fields. Yes. And the cattle. I sold most of your original stock to cover the first bank payment and the seed costs. Bought the 6 you saw with what was left after first harvest. They're good animals. Strong bloodlines. Silas looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him, without apology and without pride. Just steadily, the way a person looks at you when they have done something hard, and they are not sure whether it will be received as the gift it was meant to be or as something else entirely. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. You never thought about just, he stopped. About taking the deed? After long enough, you could have filed. It's your land, she said. Flat. Final. Like the end of a sentence that didn't need any more words added to it. I was supposed to be dead. You weren't, though, she said. Were you? He didn't answer that. Outside, the wind picked up briefly and settled again. The fire shifted in the hearth. One of the cattle in the corral made a low sound that carried through the wall. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, Silas said. Give you time to... Not sleep in the barn, Lenora said. It's your house. She stood and took her cup to the basin. I'll take the small room. I've been using it anyway. Tomorrow I'll start getting my things together. Silas looked at her back. Getting your things together, he said slowly. I'll be gone by the day after tomorrow. Give the bank your name. Get the note. What do you owe on it, he said. She paused. Then she told him the number. It was not a small number. It was not a number a man who had just returned from the wilderness with nothing but a bedroll and a carved walking stick could pay. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Maybe not in a year of very good luck. Silas felt the familiar weight settle on him, the particular heaviness of a problem that has no easy bottom. You've been making payments on that for 2 years, he said. Yes, and there's still that much left, the interest. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. He understood interest. He understood how a bank can watch a person work themselves hollow and still show up with the same open hand at the end of the season. Lenora turned around and looked at him. She had squared her shoulders, and in the lamplight, her face was composed, not cold, but resolved. The face of a woman who has made her peace with a decision and is going to stand by it, regardless of what the room around her decides. "That's not your problem anymore," she said. "You're alive. The ranch is yours. I'll figure out the rest." "With what?" he said. "That's not your concern, Mr. Crowther." The formality of it landed strangely in the warm room. Mr. Crowther, like he was someone she was doing a transaction with. The fire in the hearth and the stew on the stove and the 2 years of her life she'd poured into his land were a business arrangement that was now concluded. He watched her straighten her apron and move toward the small room at the back of the house. "Lenora," he said. She stopped. "The bank is going to want something by the end of month," he said. "Aren't they?" A pause. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. There was an arithmetic to this that he couldn't see all the way through yet, but he could see enough of it to know that whatever she was planning, whatever she thought she was going to do after walking away from this ranch with nothing, it was not going to be enough. He could see that even before he knew the full shape of it. "We'll talk in the morning," he said. She didn't argue. She just nodded once and went through the door. Silas sat alone at his table in his house that smelled like someone else's cooking and someone else's fire building, surrounded by his furniture and his wife's blue pitcher and 6 healthy cattle he hadn't raised, and the smell of a season's worth of harvest he hadn't planted. He put his face in his hands. He sat there for a long time. Outside, Redwillow Ranch breathed around him the creak of wood in the cold. The low sounds of animals settled for the night. The wind moving along the fence line that had been repaired by hands he was still trying to understand. He had come home expecting nothing. He had found everything. And the woman who had saved it was packing her bags into the next room, asking for nothing in return. He did not sleep well that night. But he did not sleep alone in a frozen mountain cabin either, and somewhere in the long hours between dark and dawn that felt like more than he deserved, he didn't hear her get up. That was the first thing that struck him in the morning, that a woman who had been running this place alone for nearly 2 years moved through it quietly enough that he'd slept through whatever she'd done before dawn. He woke to the smell of coffee already made and a fire already built up, and when he came out of the main room into the kitchen, rubbing the stiffness from his bad leg, she was standing at the stove with her back to him, frying salt pork in the iron skillet like she'd been doing it in that kitchen her whole life. Which, in a manner of speaking, she nearly had. He sat down without saying anything. She set a plate in front of him without saying anything. They ate in the particular silence of 2 people who do not yet know what kind of silence they are allowed to have with each other. The salt pork was good. The coffee was strong. Outside, frost had come in overnight, and the grass beyond the window was white and stiff and catching the early light. Silas ate half his plate before he spoke. "Tell me about the bank," he said. Lenora set her fork down. She had been expecting this, he could tell by the way she didn't hesitate, didn't look caught off guard. She'd been preparing for this conversation since before he'd sat down. "Harlan Briggs runs the Redwillow branch," she said. "He's been reasonable. As banks go, he didn't have to let me take on the note. He could have foreclosed the day the payments stopped and been within his rights." She picked up her coffee. "But he's also not a patient man. He gave me terms and I've met them. Mostly, but the past 2 payments were late." "How late?" 3 weeks. Both times. Silas looked at her. "He let it go?" "He let it go with a warning," she said. "Next one is due in," she counted, 18 days. He set his own fork down. "How much?" she told him. He didn't react outwardly. He had learned, somewhere in those 27 months of very limited options, not to let his face say things before his brain had caught up. But inwardly, something shifted, the way ice shifts on a river when it's starting to decide whether to hold or break. "What's left in the account?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Lenora." $41, she said. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at a knot near the edge that Evelyn had always said looked like a sleeping cat if you tilted your head right. $41 against a payment that was 4 times that. Against a note that still had years left on it. Against a winter that was already announcing itself in the frost on the grass outside. "I'll talk to Briggs," he said. "He'll want proof you're alive," she said. Not unkindly. Just practically, he'll want documentation. He'll want to know who owns the note now and what the plan is going forward. "I know how banks work." "I know you do," she said. I'm just saying it won't be a simple conversation. It never is with Briggs. He looked up at her. You know him? Well enough, she said. He's not cruel, but he has a way of looking at a person and deciding what category they belong in, and once you're in a category, it's hard to get out of it. Silas understood that. He had spent most of his adult life trying to get out of the category. Briggs and men like him had decided the Crowther family belonged in Landpur, debt-prone, one bad season from under. What category did he put you in, he asked. She almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of her mouth moved and then settled back. The unlikely one, she said. He watched her face for a moment. But you made the payments. Mostly. And you kept the place running. Yes. Then he was wrong about the category. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, not gratitude exactly, but something cautious and surprised, like a person who has been expecting a door to be slammed and finds it open instead. She didn't say anything. She picked up her fork again. He did the same. They finished breakfast in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they'd started with. He went out to the corral after breakfast while she cleared the dishes, and he stood with his arms on the top rail and looked at the 6 cattle for a long time. They were good animals. She hadn't been modest about that they had genuine quality. 2 of the cows were heavy with the kind of solid muscle that comes from consistent good grazing, and the bull spot. He could see he was a bull by the way. He moved through the small group, unhurried and deliberate, was broad-chested and calm. A calm bull was worth more than an aggressive one on a working ranch. You could breed a calm bull and not lose a hand doing it. He went around the outside of the corral, walking the fence line the way he always used to, looking for weakness, testing posts with his hand. The fence held. Every post was solid. The wire was right. He walked the rest of the property, slowly, which cost him because his leg did not appreciate uneven ground. But he needed to see it. All of it. He needed to understand what she had done and how she had done it, because until he understood that, he couldn't think clearly about what came next. The south field had been well planted and well harvested. He could see it in how the soil had been worked and turned. The water channel from the creek to the stock tank had been cleared and was running clean. The roof on the smaller outbuilding had been patched, not beautifully, but well enough to keep the weather out. The woodpile against the side of the house was enormous. She had put up enough wood for 2 people through the winter, not one, which meant either she had overestimated her own needs or she had been planning for contingencies. Either way, it spoke of a kind of disciplined, forward-thinking work ethic that most men he'd known didn't bother with. He came back to the front of the house and stood looking at it from the outside. It was the same house, obviously. Same walls, same windows, same roof that had always needed work on the eastern pitch. But it looked inhabited, in the real sense. Not just lived in, but cared for. The kind of caring a property takes on when the person inside it considers it worth preserving. Evelyn had made it feel that way once. He stood there longer than he meant to. She was bringing in wood from the pile when he came back around, carrying an armload that would have been ambitious for a man of ordinary build. She moved with the efficient, slightly forward-leaning walk of someone who carries heavy things regularly and has learned how to distribute the weight through their body to make it sustainable. She stopped when she saw him standing there. I want to know everything, he said. The accounts, the costs, what you sold, what you bought, what agreements you made with anyone in town. All of it. She studied him for a moment. All right, she said. Not today. After I've walked the property properly. Tomorrow morning. She nodded and carried the wood inside. He watched her go and thought about categories. The kind Briggs put people in. The kind the town put people in. The kind he himself was probably already constructing in his head, because it's what people do. They take what they can see of a person and build an explanation around it and call that understanding. He didn't know Lenora Quill. He knew what she had done. He did not know why she had really done it, not completely. The story about the debt in Tenshaw, he believed that. It had the texture of truth. But 2 years of a person's life is not paid forward by one act of remembered kindness, no matter how meaningful. There was something else in her that had made her stay. That had made her plow those fields and care for those cattle and dust, Evelyn's blue pitcher, and he didn't know what it was yet. He intended to find out. That afternoon, he walked into Redwillow with his walking stick and his borrowed coat and whatever was left of his dignity, which was not a great deal, but was enough to get a man through a door. The town had changed some. New buildings on the main street, a dry goods expansion, a small office with a lawyer's name painted on the glass, a barber shop that hadn't been there before. The same mud on the main track, the same smell of horses and coal smoke, and the particular sharp smell of cold air coming down off the northern ridgeline. People stared. He'd expected that. A dead man walking down the main street of the town that had buried him, or whatever they'd done, memorial or no, was going to attract stares. He kept his chin level and his pace steady, and tried not to favor his leg, too, obviously, though by the time he'd walked the half-mile from the ranch, his knee was aching badly enough to make him want to put the walking stick through a window. He went to the bank first. Harlan Briggs was a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of permanently unimpressed expression that certain men grow into after decades of being asked for money they're not inclined to give. He was at his desk when Silas came in, reviewing papers, and when he looked up, his face went through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Surprised doubt, calculation before settling into the careful blankness of a professional. "Crowther," he said. "Briggs, you're supposed to be dead." "So everyone keeps telling me," Silas said. He sat down across from the desk without being invited. His leg demanded it. "I'm not." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "I'll need verification of that. In writing. From someone who can attest." "I know what you need," Silas said. "I'll get you whatever you need. But first I want to understand exactly where the note on my property stands." Briggs leaned back in his chair. He folded his hands on the desk. "The note is currently held by a Lenora Quill," he said. "She entered into an agreement with this bank approximately 22 months ago. He glanced at papers to his left, without really needing to irregular payments. Mostly on time. 2 instances of significant lateness." "I know," Silas said. "What are the terms for transferring the note back to my name?" Briggs looked at him steadily. "That's not a simple thing, Mr. Crowther. You disappeared for over 2 years. The legal question of your status as owner—" "I didn't die," Silas said. "I was injured and stranded. That's different. The court may see it differently. Until a judge reviews your claim, the title—" "How long does that take?" 2 to 4 months, Briggs said. "Depending on the circuit schedule, 2 to 4 months. And a payment due in 18 days. Silas looked at the desk. "And in the meantime," he said. "In the meantime, Miss Quill's agreement with this bank remains in effect," Briggs said. "Her payment is due on the 14th, which she can't make. That is between her and this institution." "I'm asking you directly," Silas said. "Can't make the payment. I know what's in the account. Can the bank extend, Mr. Crowther?" Briggs' voice took on the particular patience of a man about to say no to something for the final time. "I was generous with Miss Quill, because she was working in good faith. I can see that she was. But good faith is not currency. Payment is not made on the 14th. The bank will begin foreclosure proceedings. Even knowing I'm alive, even knowing the title dispute will take months to sort out." Even Briggs said yes. Silas sat with that. Outside through the bank's front window, he could see the main street of Redwillow going about its afternoon business. A woman crossing with a basket. 2 men talking outside the hardware. A boy chasing a dog between the buildings. He thought about the 6 cattle in his corral. He thought about what they were worth at current market rates, and what that math looked like against 18 days, and a payment he couldn't make. And it didn't add up no matter how he arranged it. "There's nothing you can do," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Nothing that falls within my authority to do unilaterally," Briggs said. "I can take your situation to the board, but that takes time. Time I don't have." "No," Briggs agreed. "Not at the moment." Silas stood. His legs screamed at him for it, and he ignored it. "I'll be back before the 14th, he said. Briggs nodded once. His face had softened the smallest amount, which, for Harlan Briggs, was the equivalent of a speech. "For what it's worth, Mr. Crowther," he said quietly, "that woman worked this property in a way that surprised a great many people. I don't think she expected to be thanked for it, but it should be said." Silas looked at him. "It should," he agreed. He walked out into the cold. He stopped at the post office. Then at the hardware store, where a man named Dearborn, who'd known his father, looked at him like he'd seen an apparition, and then shook his hand for too long, and asked too many questions, which Silas answered briefly and accurately before excusing himself. He stopped at the general store for a few supplies he paid for, with the last of the cash he'd had on him $2, and some change, which the woman behind the counter named Margaret accepted without comment, though her eyes said plenty. Word would move through this town by nightfall. He knew that. A dead man came back. He's real, he's limping. He went to the bank. By morning, everyone would know. By afternoon tomorrow, people would have formed opinions. That was the nature of small places. They filled in the blanks of a story, whether the facts were available or not. And the blanks they filled in were usually the most interesting version, not necessarily the most accurate one. He thought about Lenora, about what those 2 years must have looked like from inside this town. A woman nobody knew, heavy-set and plain and alone, showing up to take on a dead man's debt. He could imagine how that had landed. He could imagine the looks, the quiet conversations, the particular cruelty of people who expressed doubt as concern. She'd proved them wrong, though. She'd proved them wrong every season. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon, when the light was going flat and gold across the dead grass. His leg was done. He was done. He came through the gate and had to stop and rest with his hand on the post for a moment before he could continue up to the house, and he hated being seen at less than his full capacity, even if the only one likely to see him was a woman who had by this point seen considerably more of his situation than he had of hers. She was in the barn when he came in, working with the cattle. She had a lantern hung from a hook near the stall, and she was examining the rear leg of one of the cows with focused, practiced attention, running her hands down the fetlock with a kind of careful, deliberate touch that animals trust. She looked up when he came in. "She's been favoring it," Lenora said. "Started yesterday. I don't think it's a break, feels like a strain. I've been keeping her off it." Silas looked at the cow. He looked at Lenora's hands on the animal's leg. The cow stood quiet and still under her attention. "Probably a strain," he agreed. "Keep her penned for a week." Lenora nodded and straightened up. She looked at his face and waited. She didn't ask how it went at the bank. She didn't ask what Briggs had said. She just looked at him with those steady eyes and waited for him to decide what to tell her. He liked that about her. It was not a small thing, the willingness to wait. "He won't bend on the date," Silas said. "Payment has to be made by the 14th, or he starts proceedings." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected it. "And the title question that'll take months to work through the courts," he continued. "Legally, the note is still in your name until then." "Yes," she said. "So if the payment isn't made, it's your credit that suffers first. Your name on the foreclosure." A slight tightening around her jaw. "I understand that. I'm not saying it to threaten you," he said quickly. "I'm saying it because it's the situation. And I'm trying to figure out the situation honestly." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Then quieter, "I've known this was possible. I've been working through what I'd do if it came to this. And what would you do?" She was quiet. "Lenora, what would you do?" "I'd let it go," she said. She said it the way you say something you've made peace with, even though it cost you. "I'd let them take it. I'd find something else. I always do. You'd let them take this ranch after 2 years of your life." "It's not my ranch," she said simply. He stared at her. He opened his mouth and closed again. She turned back to the cow and checked the leg one more time, then straightened up again and reached for the lantern. "I made supper," she said. "It'll be cold if we don't go in." She walked past him out of the barn. He stood in the semi-dark for a moment, listening to the cattle settle around him. "It's not my ranch," just like that. Like it was obvious. Like 2 years of a person's life, and every dollar they had, and every morning before dawn, and every fence and every field turned, and every animal tended, and every bank payment scraped together was just a thing she'd done. Not a claim, not an investment. Just a thing she'd done because it was there to be done. He came out of the barn and went into the house. Supper was beans and cornbread and the last of the salt pork, and they ate it at opposite ends of the same table. And this time, the silence was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had things moving under its surface, the way a river looks calm from above and is running fast below. Silas ate and thought. He thought about the cattle. He thought about what 2 of the better cows would bring at market right now, before winter knocked the prices down further. He thought about what the field's yield from this past season had gone toward seed costs, a payment, supplies, and what the realistic crop projection would look like for next year if things went right. He thought about his leg, which was getting better but slowly, and what he was actually physically capable of contributing to a working ranch right now, and the answer was not as much as his pride wanted to claim. He thought about Lenora. He kept coming back to Lenora. Not the fact of what she'd done, though, that was large, and kept presenting itself to him every time he looked at the ranch around him. He kept coming back to the question of her, the person, who went and did something like this. Not out of desperation, not for profit, not for gain of any kind. Because of something an anonymous man had done 7 years ago on a cold morning in a town she'd been trying to survive in. What kind of person held on to something like that and turned it into action? Not into gratitude, into action. Into years of work. Into mortgage payments. Most people would have lit a candle and called the debt paid, not built a life around it. You were a widow when I helped you, he said. She looked up. In Tenshaw, he said, you said your husband had died. That spring, yes. And you lost another husband after that. Pause. Yes, she said. He didn't push immediately. He let the space sit. You don't have to, she started. I'm not asking to be nosy, he said. I'm trying to understand who I'm dealing with. That's fair, isn't it? You know everything about my situation. I know almost nothing about yours. She considered that. She broke off a piece of cornbread and looked at it. His name was Thomas Quill, she said. We married about 4 years after my first husband passed. He was a decent man. We had 3 years together. A pause. He was thrown from a horse. He didn't survive it. I'm sorry, Silas said. She accepted that with a nod. Not brushing it off, but not dwelling. After Thomas, I moved around some, she said. Worked where I could find work. Took in laundry for a while. Helped with harvest seasons. Did some sewing. I've never been afraid of work. She said it without self-pity or pride, just as a fact. When I heard about this ranch, about Silas Crowther, and the situation with the bank it was through a woman I'd done laundry for in Tenshaw. She knew I was looking for a situation. She mentioned it almost like gossip. Lenora looked up. I don't think she expected me to do anything about it. But you did. I went and talked to Briggs the next week. Just like that. Not just like that, she said. I sat with it for a few days first. I thought about whether it was foolish. I thought about... She stopped. What? She shook her head slightly. Lenora, I thought about whether I was doing it for the right reasons or whether I was just... She put the cornbread down. Lonely people do foolish sometimes. They dress up loneliness as purpose. I wanted to make sure that wasn't what this was. Silas was quiet. Was it? He said finally. She met his eyes. There was something unguarded in her face, for just a moment something she wasn't used to showing. Some of both, she said honestly. I think. I can't fully separate them. But the work was real. Whatever else was underneath it, the work was real, and I did it right. I know you did, he said. She looked away. He thought about loneliness. He was probably the last person on earth who should judge anyone else for the things loneliness drives a person toward. He had signed on to a cattle drive to escape an empty house. He had spent 27 months on a mountain because moving had felt better than stopping. He was not exactly a study in wise measured choices. I went to the hardware today, he said, changing the angle. Talked to Dearborn, and how was that? He shook my hand for about 4 hours, Silas said. Something moved across her face. Definitely almost a smile this time. He does that, she said. You know Dearborn? I bought most of my supplies from him. He charged me fair, which not everyone did. She paused. When I first started coming into town for the ranch, there were people who thought it was. She seemed to search for a word. Strange, Silas offered. Presumptuous, she said. A woman alone, plus the way she stopped again. Looked at the table. The way I look. Some people in small towns decide what you're capable of if you've done anything. He was quiet for a moment. Dearborn didn't. Dearborn watched me come in with a supply list and a budget and leave with exactly what I needed and nothing I didn't, she said. That's all it took for him. Some people just need to see the work. And others? Others need to see the work and still find a reason to doubt it, she said dry. Those people are less interesting. Silas studied her. There was a weirciness in what she said, but also something underneath it, something that had been compressed by hardened years of exactly that experience into something almost like indifference, not the brittle kind. The kind that comes when a person has stopped needing external validation because they learned, through prolonged necessity, to provide it themselves. They'll be watching now, he said, with me back. They'll want to see what happens. They were always watching, she said. I stopped noticing after the first few months. He nodded. Outside, the wind was picking up properly now. The cold had real teeth in it tonight. He could hear it in the walls, that particular communication between a house and a hard night, the subtle creaks and adjustments. I need you to stay, he said. The room went still. She looked at him. Not as A. He stopped. Started again, because the first framing had been wrong and he knew it as soon as it started coming out. The ranch needs someone who knows it. I don't know it anymore. Not the way it is now. You know every inch of this property. You know the weak spots in the irrigation channel and what that bull's temperament is like and which field drained wrong this year. I don't know any of that. My leg isn't. It stopped again. I can work, but not at full capacity, not yet. Maybe not until spring. She was listening without expression. I can't run this place alone through the winter, he said. That's the truth. I'd rather not say it, but it's true. I know, she said quietly. And the payment, Silas. She said his name for the first time. It came out careful, like she'd tested the shape of it before she said it. Don't ask me to stay because you need the help. He looked at her. Ask me for the right reasons, she said, or don't ask. He sat with that. The fire crackled. The wind pushed at the walls. One of the cattle in the barn shifted, and the sound carried faintly through the cold night air. He thought about the right reasons. He thought about 27 months on a mountain, mostly alone, counting weeks on a wall. He thought about coming home to a house he expected to be empty and finding it full of wood smoke and care and a life someone had built inside his absence. He thought about a blue ceramic pitcher that had been dusted, carefully, by hands that had no obligation to do it. I'm not asking because I need the help, he said. I do need it. That's true. But that's not why I'm asking. She waited. I came back here expecting nothing, he said. I thought I was coming back to bury what was left of something that had already died. I thought I was going to stand in front of an empty house and figure out how to start over with nothing. And he stopped. I was not looking forward to it. I'll say that much. She said nothing. What you did here, he said. He gestured vaguely at the room around them, at the house, at everything beyond the walls. I don't have words big enough for it. I know that. I know saying thank you is nowhere near the actual size of what I owe you. You don't owe me anything, she said. That's not how I see it. I know it's not, she said, but it's how it is. He shook his head slowly. You're a stubborn woman, Lenora Quill. You're just noticing that now? She said, and there it was, the smile. Brief, real, a little crooked. Gone almost as soon as it appeared. He felt something in his chest that he didn't have a word for, something he hadn't felt in a long time, and therefore almost didn't recognize for what it was. Stay the winter, he said. That's all I'm asking right now. Stay the winter. We'll figure out the payment together. We'll figure out the legal situation. We'll figure out what this place needs to survive the season. And after that, if you want to go, you go. Free and clear. No obligation. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said, the real answer. He thought about it honestly before he spoke. Because this house was quiet for a long time before you got here, he said. And I don't think I want it to go back to that. The fire made a soft sound. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. The winter, she said. Yes. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. I'll need to know I'm earning my keep, she said finally. I don't take charity. You'd be saving my life, he said. That's not charity. That's a transaction. All right, she said. The winter. She stood and took her plate to the basin. He sat at the table and let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for some time. Outside, the wind ran itself along the fence line, the good fence, the repaired fence, the fence she had built, and the house held against it, the way a house does when it has been properly maintained by someone who intended it to last. He thought, she intended it to last. She'd intended this whole place to last, even when she was building it for a dead man's memory. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. Stayed. Not with fanfare, not with any particular ceremony. She just didn't pack her bags the next morning. And the morning after that, she was already in the barn before Silas had his boots on. And by the end of the first week, it had become simply the rhythm of the place. Two people moving through the same property with the careful, slightly formal courtesy of people who are still learning the edges of each other. It was not easy. He hadn't expected it to be. The first real friction came on a Thursday, 5 days after his return, over the water channel. Silas had gone out to look at the irrigation line from the creek to the south field, Not because anything was wrong with it, but because he needed to understand it, needed to walk the length of it, and see where she'd made changes, and why. He found the diversion point she'd added near the old cottonwood, a simple but well-placed stone and clay arrangement that split the flow and allowed the stock tank to fill even when the creek was running low. It was good work, clever even. He could see the thinking in it. He also saw a section about 40 yards north where the channel bank had started to undercut. Not badly yet. But it would be a problem by spring thaw if nothing was done about it. He came back to the house and told her. "I know about it," she said. She was at the work table, sorting seed packets she'd been storing for spring. She didn't look up. "It'll undercut fully if we don't shore it up before the ground freezes," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I was planning to get to it next week. We should do it now. Ground's already starting to harden at night." She set down the seed packet she was holding and looked at him. "I've been managing this channel for 22 months, she said. "I know when it needs attention." The tone was level, not sharp, but clear. He opened his mouth and then closed it, because she was right and he knew she was right, and arguing the point would be about his pride, not about the channel. "All right," he said. She picked up the seed packet again. They went out and shored up the channel bank together 2 days later, because the temperature dropped faster than either of them had expected and the ground was getting hard, and there was no sense waiting. They worked side by side with shovels and stone, and they didn't talk much while they did it, but it went well. And by the time they came back to the house, in the gray afternoon light, whatever small tension had been in the air between them was mostly gone. That was how it went those first weeks. Push, retreat, recalibrate. Two people with strong opinions about the right way to do things, negotiating the terms of a shared space without ever quite stating the negotiations out loud. He had habits, she had systems. His habits were older, but her systems were tuned to this specific property. And more than once he had to stop himself from doing something the way he'd always done it, when her way was plainly better suited to what the ranch had become in his absence. He didn't always stop himself in time. One afternoon, he moved the grain storage arrangement in the barn, not because there was anything wrong with it, if he was honest, but because he'd always kept grain a certain way, and the instinct was deep enough that he'd acted on it before he'd thought it through. When Lenora came into the barn that evening and saw it, she stood looking at it for a moment. "You moved the grain," she said. "It should be elevated more on the east side," he said. "Keeps moisture off the bottom bags." She was quiet for a moment. "I had it that way. I moved it when I found out the east wall sweats in deep winter. The moisture was worse elevated." He looked at the wall. He looked at the grain. He thought about it. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because she was apparently not without a sense of humor, even when she was annoyed, "But I'll move it back your way and we can see which of us is right by January." He almost laughed. He didn't quite, because he wasn't sure they were at laughing yet, but it was close. "Leave it your way," he said. "January will tell." She left it her way. In January she was right. She didn't say so. She didn't need to. The payment was the weight that sat under everything those first weeks. Silas had gone back to see Briggs on the 8th day, with a letter he'd gotten from a lawyer in Tenshaw, a man named Corbin, who did circuit work through the basin and had agreed to come out and verify Silas's identity formally for a fee that Silas put on account against whatever the ranch could eventually pay. Briggs had received the letter with the same unimpressed gravity he received everything, and had said that the legal process would proceed, but that the 14th remained the 14th regardless. 9 days. Silas and Lenora sat at the table after supper on the 9th day and laid the situation out on paper the way you have to when the problem is bigger than what you can hold in your head. She had the ledger. She'd been keeping a plain cloth-covered book that she opened flat between them. Her handwriting was careful and small and completely legible, every entry dated, every amount exact. He looked at it and thought about the kind of discipline required to maintain a record like that through 2 years of hard physical work, to sit down at the end of a long day and write down every dollar in and out before you slept. Most men he knew didn't bother. "The bull has value," he said, looking at the numbers. "Yes," she said. "If we sold him now before winter drives prices down further, we'd lose our best breeding stock," she said. "Next spring's calves would be from whatever we could afford to replace him with, which wouldn't be much. I know. But if we don't make the payment, there won't be a next spring." She sat with that. He watched her face. She was running numbers in her head. He could see it. The slight shift in her eyes that meant she was looking at something internal rather than external. If we sell the 2 older cows, she said slowly, not the bull, cows, we'd lose their production value. But they're past their best breeding years anyway, and the price we'd get for them right now, before winter. She stopped. Still won't be enough. Not the full payment, he said. Not the full payment. But it might be enough for Briggs to negotiate. He looked at her. He won't negotiate, he said. He might, she said, if we come to him with something real. Not a promise, a payment, partial, with a plan. Briggs is a bank man. He wants the note serviced, not the property. Foreclosure costs him money and time and trouble. If we give him a number and a credible plan for the rest. He said he wouldn't bend. He said he couldn't do it unilaterally, she corrected. He said it had to go to the board. That's different. Silas looked at her across the table. She was right. He'd replayed that conversation with Briggs several times in the past days, and she'd caught something he'd let slide by. You weren't in that meeting, he said. No, she said. But I've had a lot of meetings with Harlan Briggs. I know how he says yes when he means yes, and I know how he says no when he means maybe. And you think that was a maybe. I think we go back with the money from the cows and a written plan, and we find out, she said. He looked at the ledger again, at the numbers, at the careful handwriting that represented 2 years of her life compressed into columns of figures. All right, he said. She nodded and reached across to turn to a clean page. Let's write the plan, she said. They sold the 2 cows to a rancher named Pickett, who ran a larger spread 10 miles south of them, a quiet transaction that Pickett completed without fanfare, and for a fair price fair being a relative term in late autumn, but fair enough. He loaded the animals the following morning and paid in banknotes, and Silas stood at the gate and watched them go, with the complicated feeling of a man watching part of what someone else built get reduced to paper money. Lenora didn't watch. She was in the barn with the remaining 4 animals, doing something routine and necessary, and when he came back in, she looked at the notes in his hand and nodded once and went back to what she was doing. They went to see Briggs together. That was Silas's decision, and he made it the evening before, without fully explaining his reasoning to her, just saying, I'd like you to come. She had looked at him steadily and said all right, and that was the end of it. In the bank, Briggs looked from Silas to Lenora and back with the careful face of a man recalibrating. Miss Quill, he said. Mr. Briggs, she said. I see you 2 have become acquainted. She saved my ranch, Silas said. I think we're past acquainted. Briggs looked at him for a moment, then down at the paper Silas placed on his desk the partial payment, the written plan, the projected income figures for next season based on Lenora's knowledge of the land, and Silas's cattle experience combined. He read it slowly. He was a slow, thorough reader. Briggs, the kind of man who went back to the top of a page if he felt he'd missed something. Then he sat back. You're short, he said. We know we're short, Silas said. That's what the plan addresses. The plan is optimistic. The plan is based on 2 years of this woman's records, Silas said. Actual yield figures, not projections, actual numbers. Briggs looked at Lenora. Is that accurate, he said. You have the quarterly statements I filed, she said. The plan uses those numbers as the baseline and applies a reasonable growth estimate for the spring season, given that we'll have 2 people working the property instead of 1. Briggs folded his hands on the desk. The clock on the wall ticked. I'll take it to the board, he said. Lenora sat very still. When? Silas asked. End of the week, Briggs said. I can't promise an outcome, but I'll take it. It was not a yes, but it was exactly as Lenora had read it, a maybe. They walked out of the bank into the cold main street and stood there for a moment, not quite looking at each other. End of the week, Silas said. Yes, she said, that's something. That's something, she agreed. They walked back to the ranch. 4 miles in the cold, mostly in silence. But the silence had changed texture again. It had the feel of 2 people who have just done something difficult together and are still absorbing what it felt like. The board approved a partial extension with conditions. The letter came on a Saturday, delivered by the post rider who looked mildly overwhelmed by the significance of what he was carrying, though he couldn't have known it. Silas opened it at the table with Lenora standing across from him, and he read it twice before he told her what it said. The bank would accept the partial payment. They would extend the remaining balance across an additional 2 seasons. with a higher interest rate applied to the extension period. The conditions included a quarterly accounting submitted to the bank and a site visit by Briggs or his representative in the spring. It was not generous. The higher interest rate was punishing in a way that was technically within the bank's rights, but felt like the institution's way of asserting that it had done them a favor and expected them to know it. But it was survivable. If they worked the land right, if the spring went well, if nothing catastrophic happened, which on a frontier ranch was always the biggest, if it was survivable. It's enough, Lenora said. The interest rate is going to hurt, he said. Everything hurts, she said. This kind we can work with. He looked at her across the table. You knew he'd take it to the board, he said. I thought there was a reasonable chance, she said. Reasonable isn't certain. But you were right. She looked slightly uncomfortable with that. Like being right was something she'd prefer not to make a fuss about. We were right, she said. It was your idea to bring the plan in writing. She stopped. What? I just read the man correctly, she said. That's not a great skill. It's just paying attention. He shook his head slightly. She had a particular way of doing this, of distributing credit outward, of deflecting the part that was hers, and he had noticed it enough times now to recognize it as a pattern rather than a single instance of modesty. It was not false modesty, exactly. It was something more complicated. A woman who had spent enough time, Kenshin told, her contributions weren't significant, that she had preemptively stopped claiming them as self-protection. He didn't know how to address that directly. He wasn't sure it was his place to try. Not yet. But he noticed it. All right, he said. We were right. She seemed to relax slightly. Now we have to earn it, she said. Yes, he said. We do. Winter arrived in earnest that year without much warning and without any consideration for the fact that Redwillow Ranch was already operating below capacity. The first real storm came in the third week of November, not the tentative early storms that had been gesturing toward winter for weeks, but the genuine article, with 2 feet of snow and wind that drove it horizontal, and a cold that had real malice in it. They had 3 days' warning from the weather signs. Lenora had learned to read over 2 winters on this land. She knew which clouds meant what, and how the animals behaved differently in the hours before a serious storm, and what the creek did when a real one was coming. So when she said, on the Tuesday morning before the storm hit, we have until Thursday, maybe Friday at the outside, he didn't question it. He just asked her what needed to happen before then, and they divided the work and did it. The cattle were moved into the sheltered enclosure on the south side of the barn. The remaining grain was checked and consolidated. The woodpile was further augmented by a half cord they cut together from deadfall in the small stand of timber at the northeast edge of the property, Silas with the axe, and Lenora splitting and stacking, a division of labor that had arranged itself without discussion based on who could do what, which was its own kind of negotiation. His leg was improving.
What?
It still ached in the cold with a deep, grinding persistence that no amount of ignoring entirely eliminated, but he could work for longer stretches now without stopping, and the limp was less pronounced on level ground. He'd stopped using the walking stick, except for long distances, which was a kind of milestone he hadn't acknowledged out loud, because acknowledging it felt like tempting something. Storm hit Thursday night. Silas woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of it, a sound the wind makes when it's found the edge of something and is working at it, a particular tone that is both high and deep at once. He lay in the dark for a moment listening. Then he heard the cattle. He got dressed in the dark quickly and went out. The barn door was already open. Not open, Lenora was coming through it, her coat pulled tight, snow in her hair. She had a lantern in one hand, and her expression was focused in the way it got when she was dealing with a problem that required her full attention. The young cow, she said, the one that was favoring her leg. She's in distress. He went in with her. The cow was in the back corner of the barn, separated from the others. She was down on her knees when they came in, which was wrong. Cattle don't choose to go to their knees unless something is seriously wrong. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes were showing white around the edges. Silas went down beside her. His hands found the places that told him what he needed to know: the temperature, the tension in her muscles, the specific way she was holding herself. When did this start? He said. I checked at midnight, Lenora said. She was standing then. Restless, but standing. She held the lantern closer. She's trying to calf, he said. Lenora went still for a moment. She shouldn't be. She's not due until I know when she's due, he said. She's going anyway. A stressed cow, a too early birth, a blizzard outside. This was the kind of night a ranch could lose an animal it couldn't afford to lose. She needs to get up, Silas said. We need to get her on her feet or we're going to lose both of them. What followed was an hour and a half of the kind of work that doesn't look like much from the outside, just two people in a cold barn, hands on an animal, talking quietly, moving her, coaxing her, managing the slow, difficult process of a delivery that was coming whether they were ready or not. Lenora had done this before. He could tell she didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Her hands were sure and calm, and she talked to the animal in a low, continuous murmur that had no specific content except steadiness. He worked alongside her. The calf came just past 4 in the morning. Small, too small for a good outcome in this cold, but alive. Silas had his coat off and was working to get the calf warm, rubbing, moving it, keeping the blood going, while Lenora stayed with the cow, who had made it through but was spent and trembling. The wind outside was at its worst, the barn walls shuddering with it, and the lantern threw their shadows large and uncertain against the walls. Calf found its feet at 20 minutes, wobbly and uncertain and far too small for the world it had just arrived in, but upright. The cow turned her head and her nose found it, and the sound she made was low and private. Lenora sat back on her heels and let out a long breath. Silas's hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, or not only from cold. He pressed them flat against his knees. It's going to need extra warmth for the next few days, he said. More than the barn's going to give it in this. I'll bring it inside, she said. He looked at her. Into the house, she said with a slight tone that suggested she was already anticipating an argument. Into the house, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment, like she'd been ready to argue the point, and was slightly thrown by not needing to. All right, she said. They stayed in the barn until the cow was calm and the calf was feeding and the worst of the wind had passed through to its next destination. Then Lenora wrapped the calf in a feed sack and carried it to the house, which was its own remarkable thing, to watch a heavy-set woman in a snow-covered coat carrying a newborn calf through a blizzard at 4:30 in the morning, without any visible sense that this was not completely ordinary. Silas followed her in. The calf spent 3 days in the kitchen near the stove, in a box lined with straw that Lenora assembled with the calm efficiency of a woman who had apparently thought through this exact contingency at some point. Cow survived. The calf survived small, but determined, with an obstinate tendency to attempt to stand at inconvenient moments that eventually became its defining characteristic. Silas named it, without meaning to, on the second day. He said when the calf lurched into a chair for the 4th time and looked briefly confused and then tried again. Stubborn little fool. And then, because he'd said it fondly, all right, fool, get up. Lenora heard this from across the room. She said nothing. But the corner of her mouth did that thing it did. The calf's name became Fool, and it eventually grew into a fine, healthy animal. And Silas was never entirely comfortable with how much he came to like something he'd named Fool, but that's ranch life. The winter was hard, but they moved through it. There was a particular quality to those months that Silas had not expected and didn't know how to name. While it was happening, he only understood it later, looking back. The way you understand most things that matter. It was the quality of two people making something work that shouldn't have worked. That logic said was too complicated and too weighted with history and obligation and unanswered questions to function. And yet it did function. Not smoothly, never smoothly, but steadily. They had a serious argument in December. It was about the spring planting plan, technically. But it wasn't really about the spring planting plan. She had laid out her rotation based on what she knew from the previous 2 seasons, which fields had yielded well, which had drained poorly where the soil needed rest. It was a careful, evidence-based plan. He disagreed with the wheat allocation. He thought she was underplanting wheat and over-allocating to the kitchen garden, and he said so. She said the kitchen garden had kept her from buying supplies that she couldn't afford, and reducing it was a risk he didn't fully appreciate because he hadn't been here for the months when money was genuinely short. He said he understood money being short. He'd spent 27 months having nothing, and she didn't need to explain financial hardship to him. She said that was not what she'd meant. He said it was close enough to what she'd meant. The room went sharp and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Lenora put her pencil down on the table. She did it carefully in a way that meant she was controlling something. "I am not trying to minimize what you went through," she said. Her voice was very level, the kind of level that takes work. "I am saying that I have specific knowledge of this specific property's specific needs, which I earned by being here. And I would appreciate it if you would argue with my plan on its merits rather than using my experience to question whether I've ever suffered enough to have an opinion." The room was quiet for a long moment. He felt the particular shame of a man who has said something badly and knows it. "That's fair," he said. She looked at him. "That was fair," he said again. "You're right. He stopped. "I do that. Use bigger suffering to win smaller arguments." "Not." He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not right." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not. I'm sorry." Another moment of silence. "The wheat allocation," she said. She picked her pencil back up. "Tell me specifically what you'd change and why," he told her, specifically, without reaching for anything other than the actual agricultural argument. She listened. She pushed back on two of his points with evidence. He conceded one and held the other. They compromised on a split allocation that was neither her original plan nor his preference, but was probably, they both privately suspected, better than either one. They did not apologize again. They did not discuss what had happened underneath the argument. They just went forward, which is what people do when they are trying to build something, and they've decided that building it matters more than being right. But some things had shifted slightly. In the way things shift after two people have seen each other at less than their best and decided to keep going anyway. In the deep middle of January, on a night when the cold had settled into the particular breathless stillness that means it has fully committed, Silas found himself sitting by the fire after Lenora had gone to bed, not sleeping, which had become a pattern in the past weeks that he didn't examine too closely. He was not sleeping because he was thinking. He was thinking about Evelyn. This happened less than it used to. In the first months after her death, before the cattle drive, thinking about her had been constant and involuntary. She came up the way breathing comes up, without choice. On the mountain, it had been different. Grief in extreme circumstances becomes something functional, something you carry rather than something you drown in, because drowning costs energy you don't have. But now in this warm house, in front of this fire, he found himself thinking about her with something new mixed into the grief, something he felt guilty about and then felt guilty about, feeling guilty about, which was its own circular problem. He was thinking about the blue pitcher on the shelf. He was thinking about the fact that it had been dusted. He was thinking about the grave in the south edge of the property which he had visited once since his return. A difficult morning when he'd stood there with his hat in his hands and not known what to say. The grave had flowers on it. Dried now, winter, flowers, the kind that had been put there in fall before the cold took everything. He'd touched the dried stems and thought, she did this. Lenora had put flowers on his wife's grave. Not for him. He hadn't been here. She'd done it for what? Out of respect for a woman she'd never met. Out of a sense that this land had a history worth honoring. Out of something in her that could not let a grave go untended even when no one was watching. He sat with that in the firelight for a long time. He was not a man who came to his feelings quickly. He was the kind of man who arrived at an emotion after considerable travel, often arriving to find it had been there for some time already, waiting. He sat there until the fire burned low, and then he put another log on because the cold was serious tonight and the house needed to hold. And he went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the house and thought that silence had a different quality. When you knew there was another person somewhere in it. Not lonely. Not the silence he'd come home to expecting. Something else entirely. He did not have a word for it yet. He was getting there. February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days. And then a hard freezist again, which was worse than consistent cold because the thaw loosened things that the freeze then cracked. They lost a section of the water channel, not the section he'd wanted to shore up in autumn, as it happened, which Lenora also did not say anything about, to her credit, and they spent 2 days in sharp cold repairing it with stones and packed clay and language that neither of them commented on afterward. Silas's leg, which had been slowly improving, got worse for a week during the hard freeze. He didn't say anything about it for 3 days, which was long enough for Lenora to notice that he was favoring it more severely without him telling her, because by that point she knew how he moved well enough to know when it was wrong. She didn't say anything directly. She just adjusted the work division without comment, taking on the heavier outside tasks, leaving him the things that could be done from a standing position in the barn or at the work table. She did it so quietly that he might not have noticed it was intentional if he hadn't already learned how intentional she was about most things. He noticed. He didn't know how to receive it. He wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, but it was necessary, and saying it wasn't would be lying, and he'd already learned that she had very little patience for him, lying about practical realities. So instead, he said, one evening when she came in from a fence check, he'd usually done himself. "Thank you." She stopped, looked at him. Her coat was still on and her cheeks were red from the cold, and she had the slightly wind-burned look of a person who has been outside longer than was strictly comfortable. "You'd do the same," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still saying thank you." She considered him for a moment, like she was deciding whether to deflect it. She didn't, this time. "You're welcome," she said. She took her coat off and hung it up and went to put the kettle on, and Silas sat at the table and thought that this ordinary evening, this unremarkable exchange in a warm kitchen at the end of a cold day, was something he had not expected to have again. He was glad he was wrong about that. He was very glad he was wrong about that. The winter months and still had months to go, and the spring plank's quarterly review and the long work of a season that had to go well were all still ahead of them. The road was not short, and it was not easy. But somewhere in the middle of February, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, Silas Crowther looked across the room at the woman who saved his ranch and kept his wife's grave and carried a newborn calf through a blizzard at 4 a.m, and he thought, "I am not ready for her to leave." He thought, "I don't think she is going to leave." He thought, "I don't know what that means yet, but I think it means something." He kept those thoughts to himself. He was still arriving at them, but he was closer than he'd been in autumn, and getting closer still, and the house was warm, and outside the freeze had broken slightly, and the cattle were alive, and the calf named Fool was attempting to stand up in the barn with its particular stubborn energy, and for the first time in a long time longer than 27 months, and if he was honest, Silas Crowther did not feel like a man at the end of something. He felt tentatively, and with full knowledge that the feeling could be wrong, like a man at the beginning. Spring came the way it always does on the high basin, not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in increments so small you only notice them in accumulation. A morning where the cold had less bite than the one before. A week where the mud stayed soft instead of freezing back overnight. The first green at the edges of the creek bank, tentative and thin, as if the grass wasn't entirely sure the freeze was finished with it yet. Silas noticed it the way a man notices things when he has spent a winter paying close attention to a piece of land he is trying to keep alive. He noticed it, and he noticed Lenora noticing it, the way her eyes went to the south field each morning when she came out to the porch, reading something in it that she'd been reading for 2 years before he came back. The winter had done things to both of them that neither one fully acknowledged out loud. It had put them in the same rooms through the same hard nights and the same cold mornings, and whatever distance they'd maintained in those first careful weeks had compressed over the months into something different, not the distance of strangers, not quite the ease of people who had chosen each other, but something in between. The particular closeness of two people who have faced a series of difficult things together and come out the other side still standing. They argued less, or rather, they argued better with more precision and less injury, which is the difference between people who are competing and people who are trying to solve the same problem. He had learned where her lines were. She had learned where his pride lived and how to work around it without making him feel managed, which was a skill he privately recognized and appreciated and would never in his life say out loud. What he had not done through all of it was say the thing that had been building in him since sometime in February. He knew it was there. He was not a man who deceived himself about his own interior life, at least not for very long. He knew what he felt, and he knew approximately when it had stopped being gratitude and become something else. And he also knew that saying it was a risk of a kind he had not faced since before Evelyn died, and was not entirely sure he remembered how to take. Lenora was not a woman who made it easy. Not intentionally, he didn't think it was intentional. But she had built her independence so carefully over so many years of necessity that it had become structural. She didn't lean. She didn't leave gaps for another person to fill. She occupied her own space completely and efficiently and left no obvious openings, which meant that approaching her required a particular kind of directness that felt, to Silas, uncomfortably close to vulnerable. He was working on it. In the meantime, there was spring planting. Briggs's representative arrived on a Tuesday in late March, not Briggs himself, but a younger man named Fentress, who had the look of someone sent to do a task he found slightly beneath him, but was professional enough to do properly. He walked the property with Silas and Lenora together, making notes in a small book, asking questions about the field rotation and the livestock numbers and the waters situation. Lenora answered most of the questions. Not because Silas deferred to her exactly, but because she knew the details, and they both knew she knew them, and in this particular context, pretending otherwise would have been foolish performance. Fentress noticed. At the end of the walk, standing near the barn, he looked at his notes and then at the two of them. "The records Miss Quill has kept are thorough," he said. "Mr. Briggs will be satisfied with the accounting." He paused, just slightly. "I'll be honest with you both, when this arrangement was first described to me, I was skeptical of the viability." "I know you were," Lenora said, not unkindly, just evenly. Fentress looked at her for a moment. "I was wrong," he said. Lenora accepted that with a nod. The same nod she gave most things not warm, not cold, just present. Fentress left after lunch. They watched him ride out from the porch. "He was surprised," Silas said. "He always is," she said. "Always?" "Men like that always are," she said. "It's not malice. It's just they have a picture of what's possible, and I don't fit in it, so they're surprised when I'm there anyway." Silas looked at the road where Fentress had gone. "Does it bother you?" he said. "Still, after 2 years of it bothered me less every time I made a payment," she said. She glanced at him. "That's the thing about proving something. You don't prove it to them. You prove it to yourself. They're just the occasion for it." He turned to look at her. She was looking out at the property, the fields that were greening, the corral with its animals, the fence line running clean and tight to the horizon. He thought, she built this out of a debt. She felt she owed a man she'd never properly met, and she is standing here looking at it not with ownership, but with something quieter and more honest than ownership. She's looking at it the way a person looks at something they did right, in a world that gave them very little reason to expect they could. He said, before he'd entirely decided to, "I don't want you to go." She went still, not in a startled way, in the way of a person who has been expecting a door and is now standing in front of it. "Silas, I know I said the winter," he said. "I know that's what I asked for. But I'm telling you now that it was the wrong thing to ask for. I asked for the winter because I thought if I asked for more you'd say no, and I needed you to say yes to something." She turned and looked at him. "That's honest," she said slowly. "I'm trying to be." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the new grass, and the cattle shifted in the corral, and somewhere on the far side of the barn, the calf named Fool made the particular sound it made when it wanted attention. "What are you asking now?" she said. He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not for the ranch. The ranch is I am grateful, and the ranch needs you, and all of that is true. But that's not what I'm asking." She held his gaze. "You don't know me that well," she said. It wasn't a rejection. It was careful, precise, like she was checking the weight of something before she tried to carry it. "I know you well enough," he said. "You know how I work," she said. "You know what I do under pressure. You know some of what I've been through. That's not the same as knowing a person." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's enough to want to know the rest." She looked away, out at the field again. He waited. He had learned how to wait, at least. 27 months on a mountain had given him that much. "I've lost 2 husbands," she said quietly, 2 houses. "I've started over more times than I should have had to. Every time I thought I was somewhere I could stay, something—" She stopped. "I'm not saying that as a reason. I'm saying it so you understand that I don't make this kind of decision easily anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm not young," she said. "Neither am I." "I'm not—" She stopped again. This one was different. There was something in it that was harder to say. "What?" he said gently. She was quiet for a moment. "People have spent my whole life telling me what I'm not," she said finally. "I'm not the right size, not the right kind, not who someone like you ought to be asking." She looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but there was something in them that was not quite steady, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time and was aware of the risk of being put down. I know what I am. I know what I'm not. I just need to know that you do too. Silas looked at her for a moment. He thought carefully before he spoke, because this deserved care. You are the woman who made my bank payments when I was supposed to be dead, he said. You are the woman who plowed my fields and tended my cattle and kept the fence up and put flowers on my wife's grave and carried a newborn calf through a blizzard and never once asked for anything in return. You are the woman who told Harlan Briggs to watch her and then gave him 2 years of worth watching. He paused. I know what you are, Lenora. I've been watching for 6 months. I am not confused about what I'm looking at. She didn't speak. The other things you mentioned, he said, they're not relevant to me. I'd appreciate it if you'd believe that. She looked at him for a long time. He held it. I'm not going to give you an answer right now, she said. All right, he said. I need to think. All right, he said again. She nodded once and went back inside. He stood on the porch alone for a while. The wind was mild and the fields were green and the future was completely uncertain, which was, he was learning, not the worst thing in the world to be standing in the middle of. She didn't give him an answer that day or the next. She was not cold about it. She was not strange or distant. She was exactly as she'd been present, direct, working alongside him with the same focused competence she brought to everything. But she was thinking. He could see it in the slight inwardness of her expression sometimes, in the way she'd pause over a task and look at nothing for a moment before returning to it. He let her think. He planted the wheat, and she managed the kitchen garden, and they worked the spring rotation together. And the land that had survived the winter came up green and deliberate, the way land does when it's been properly tended going into the cold and properly encouraged coming out of it. Cattle were well. Fool had grown into something that was technically a calf, but was acquiring the stubborn confidence of a much larger animal, with a tendency to plant itself in doorways and look at whoever wanted to pass with an expression of complete unconcern. Silas had given up trying to understand why he was fond of this animal. He was simply fond of it. The second quarterly payment to the bank came due in April, and they made it on time, which was the first payment made fully on time since before Silas's return, and when he told Lenora, she just said, "Good," in the tone of someone checking something off a list they'd been maintaining for a long time. The town had absorbed his return by now. The initial strangeness of a dead man walking the main street had settled into something more. Ordinary people nodded to him. Dearborn shook his hand with more normal duration. The woman at the post office stopped looking at him like a question she couldn't answer. He was back. He was working his ranch. He had a woman out there helping him. Opinions on that varied, because opinions on everything vary in a small town, but the results were visible. And results are hard to argue with for long. He went into town one Thursday, in mid-April, for supplies and was in the hardware talking to Dearborn about a piece of equipment he needed when a man he didn't recognize came in. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed in a frontier, way not rich exactly, but comfortable. He had the ease of a man who owns enough to not worry much. The man looked at Silas with the slight evaluating look of someone who has heard a story and is now seeing the person the story was about. Crowther? He said, "That's right," Silas said. The man put out his hand. "Gareth Pelham. I run the Pelham spread east of the basin." He said it with the tone of a man who expects that the name to mean something. Silas had heard of Pelham. Larger operation. Ran several hundred head. Had interests in more than just cattle, some land dealings, some involvement with the timber operation to the north. The name carried weight in the basin, in a particular way, the weight of accumulated resource rather than just work. "I've heard about your situation," Pelham said. "The bank, the woman out there." He said it with a specific kind of casual authority, the way men like this often say things as if the information belongs to them by virtue of their position. "I might be interested in discussing a purchase arrangement." Silas looked at him. "Purchase of what?" He said. "The eastern acreage," Pelham said. "You're carrying debt. I know the numbers, more or less. Basin's not big. Word travels. I could take that eastern section off your hands, give you enough to clear a significant portion of the note, simplify your situation considerably." Dearborn had gone very quiet behind his counter. The hardware store had a particular acoustic quality that made conversations carry, which was something most people who had those conversations either didn't know or had forgotten. Silas kept his voice level. I'm not selling, he said. Pelham smiled, not unpleasant, the smile of a man who has heard this before and is patient about it. The offer stands. Debt has a way of changing a man's position over time. When you're ready to talk, I won't be, Silas said, but I appreciate you introducing yourself. The last part was dismissal, and they both knew it. Pelham accepted it without visible offense and moved on to his own business. Silas paid for his supplies and walked home. He told Lenora about it that evening. She was quiet while he described the conversation. She had a particular stillness when she was processing something she didn't like, not a visible reaction, just a gathering of attention. Pelham's been interested in that eastern acreage for 3 years, she said. Silas stopped. You know about this? He approached me in the first winter, she said. Came out to the ranch. Said he'd heard about the situation with the note and wanted to help. She said the word with a faint dryness. He had a purchase offer. I told him the land wasn't mine to sell. But it wasn't mine, she said. It was never mine, I was holding it. He looked at her. He came back in the spring, she said. Same offer, higher number. I told him the same thing. Lenora, why didn't you? What? She said. Tell a man who was supposed to be dead that someone was trying to buy part of his land? I handled it. You handled it, he said. Twice. Yes. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at her. You are the most... He stopped. Started again. Do you have any idea how many decisions you made about this place that you never told me about? Quite a few, she said without apology. He stopped again. Necessary, she said. At the time it was necessary. You weren't here. And then when you were here, it was... She paused. I didn't think it mattered anymore. You were back. The situation was under control. It matters, he said. What Pelham's doing matters. He'll come back. Yes, she said. He will. And now he knows I'm back, and the note is still active, and he'll wait, Silas said. He'll wait until there's a hard season, and he'll come back with a number when our backs are against it. Lenora nodded slowly. That's what I'd do, she said, if I were him. So we can't have a hard season. She looked at him steadily. We should have thought about that before we bought a ranch in the frontier, she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his chest. Not a heavy thing, almost the opposite. Light and slightly absurd and completely unexpected. He laughed. It came out short and surprised, more of a released breath than a full laugh, but it was real. He hadn't laughed, he realized, and he couldn't remember how long. Lenora looked at him. Something in her face that was careful and surprised and cautiously pleased, all at once. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. He settled. The levity didn't entirely leave the room. It stayed at the edges. We're not selling to Pelham, he said. No, she agreed. We're not, and we need a good season. We need a very good season, she said. She reached for the ledger and opened it to the spring planning pages, which is why I'd like to talk about the water allocation for the northern section. I think we've been under-irrigating it. I think there's more yield capacity there than we've been accessing. He leaned forward. Show me, he said. May was hard in a specific way that May sometimes is on the high basin, not cold, but dry, with a wind that came off the northern ridgeline and pulled moisture out of everything it touched. The creek ran lower than Lenora had seen it in 2 springs, and the water allocation she and Silas had planned carefully and argued over productively became something they had to revise in real time as the actual contingents diverged from what they'd planned for. That was the nature of the work. You planned for what you knew and you adapted to what arrived. They adapted well. He thought that was worth noting. Even if he didn't say it out loud, they adapted well together. Their systems, which had been 2 septs being negotiated into one, had by this point genuinely merged in the places where merging was efficient and remained separate in the places where their individual approaches produced better results. It was not a perfect arrangement. Nothing about Redwillow Ranch was perfect. But it functioned, and it functioned in the specific, hard-won way that things function when the people maintaining them have learned each other. The North Field, as Lenora had predicted, had more to give than they'd been drawing from it. The redirection of irrigation water she'd proposed, the one Silas had initially questioned and then agreed to try, showed results in the 3rd week of May that both of them found quietly satisfying, which they expressed by not saying anything and going back to work. Cattle were doing well. All 4 adults were healthy, and the spring had brought 2 calves from the remaining cows, one strong and one that needed a little more attention, but was coming along. Fool, who was no longer a calf by any technical measure, had developed the habit of standing near the fence on the side, closest to the house, and watching the human activity with an air of supervisory concern. Lenora had begun, Silas noticed, talking to Fool when she passed. He did not mention this to her. The Pelham question came up again in late May, not from Pelham himself, but from a different direction. A woman named Clara Hess, who owned the millinery in town and was one of the few people who had been straightforwardly kind to Lenora in the early months, who had said, reportedly, that she didn't know what people's objections were. A person who paid their bills and kept to themselves was a person worth having in a community, came out to the ranch on a Saturday with a reason that turned out to be thinner than the actual reason. The actual reason emerged after coffee and some pleasant talk about the spring. Gareth Pelham has been talking, Clara said. She was a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a manner of delivering information that was direct without being unkind. Lenora put down her cup. Talking about what? Silas said. About the ranch, about the 2 of you. Clara paused. About the irregularity of the situation. An unmarried woman, a man who was declared dead, an unclaimed property title. She looked at them both. He's not being vicious about it, but he's being deliberate. People are talking about whether the title situation is clean enough to minus... To what? Lenora said. Her voice was very quiet. To warrant a legal challenge, Clara said. He has a lawyer in Harwick looking at it. Whether the extended period of absence in the third-party mortgage arrangement creates any ambiguity in the ownership. The room was quiet. Silas felt something cold and focus settle into him. Particular cold of a man who has been in genuinely dangerous situations and knows the difference between a threat that can be faced directly and one that operates through oblique channels. He can't do that, Lenora said. He's looking at whether he can, Clara said. The title is clear, Silas said. My name, the original deed. Corbin verified my identity. The court in Harwick closed the presumed death question 4 months ago. I know, Clara said, and Briggs knows that. But if Pelham finds a lawyer willing to argue the in-between period, the months when you were declared dead, and Lenora held the note he might create enough legal complexity to. She stopped, to make the whole situation expensive to fight, even if you'd win in the end. Expensive to fight, on a ranch still carrying debt, with a good season that was good but not yet finished, with a quarterly payment coming in July. Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at Lenora. She was looking at the table, her jaw kept tight. He knew that expression, but by now it was the expression of a woman running options rapidly in her head and not liking any of them. Thank you for telling us, she said to Clara without looking up. I thought you should know, Clara said. I thought, she paused. I like to think I know something about what's fair and what isn't. This isn't fair, but fair doesn't always win without help. After Clara left, they sat in the kitchen for a long time. He's going after the in-between period, Silas said. The months between when I was declared dead and when I came back. He'll argue that during that period the title was in question and Lenora's assumption of the note created a competing claim. It's not a strong argument, Lenora said. No, he said, but it doesn't have to be strong. It has to be expensive enough to be worth settling. She looked up at him. He wants us to settle, she said. He wants us to get tired, he said. A legal fight costs money and time and attention. We have limited money. We have a season that needs attention, and time is the one thing you can't manufacture. He knows that. Lenora was quiet. There's one thing that simplifies the title question, Silas said carefully. He said it carefully because he knew how it was going to land, and he wanted it to land right. One thing that removes the ambiguity from the in-between period entirely. She looked at him. If we were married, he said, the property would be jointly held. There'd be no question of competing claims. Lenora Quill as a stranger who held a note is a legal complication. Lenora Crowther as a spouse is not. He watched her face. She was very still. I'm not asking you to marry me for legal reasons, he said. I want to be clear about that. I asked you to stay for reasons I told you on the porch last month, and those reasons haven't changed. But I'm telling you that legally, practically, for the protection of what we've both put into this ranch, it would solve the problem. It would solve the problem, she repeated slowly. Yes, and that's why you're bringing it up. I'm bringing it up, he said, Because Pelham is about to try to use the irregularity of our situation against us, and you deserve to know all the options, and this is one of them." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. "You asked me to stay," she said. "On the porch, in April." "Yes, I didn't give you an answer." "No, you didn't." "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it every day," she said. "And I've been—" She stopped, pressed her mouth together for a moment. "I've been afraid." That's the honest answer. "Not of you specifically. Of this. Of building something again and having it taken or leaving or ending wrong." "I know," he said. "But I've also been stop. I've been happier here this winter and spring than I have been anywhere in a very long time. And I know some of that is the work. Because I love the work. But some of it is," she looked at him. "Some of it is you." Kitchen was very quiet. "Some of it is definitely the calf," he said. She laughed. Real, this time. Short and surprised and completely genuine, and it changed her whole face in a way he'd been waiting a long time to see properly. "Fool is part of it," she agreed. He looked at her. Her face was still open from the laugh, still unguarded, and in it he could see clearly the thing she didn't usually let show: the hoping, the wanting, the willingness, terrifying to her, an obviously hard one, to believe that this particular thing might hold. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of Pelham, not for the title, because you've been thinking about it every day for a month, and so have I. And the answer is yes, and we both know it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're insufferably direct sometimes," she said. "Only sometimes?" The corner of her mouth. The familiar movement. "Yes," she said. He took a breath. "Yes, I will," she said clearly. "If we're doing this." "We're doing this," he said. She nodded once. She looked at the table. She looked back at him. She seemed to be absorbing it, the reality of a decision that had been approaching for a long time finally arriving. "We should probably tell Briggs," she said. "It affects the title documentation." "We can tell Briggs on Monday," he said. "And we need to talk to Corbin about the legal implications for the—" "Lenora," he said. She stopped. "Corbin on Tuesday," he said. "Briggs on Monday. Tonight we can just—" He gestured, slightly helplessly, at the kitchen and the warm fire and the evening outside the window and the fact of what had just happened. She looked at the gesture. She understood it. "Tonight we can just—" she agreed. She got up and put the kettle on for no particular reason, except that it was something to do with her hands. And he sat at the tin kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the fresh earth smell that came in through the window from the Springfields outside. He thought about Pelham and his lawyers and his careful, patient strategy of pressure and waiting. He thought, "We are not as easy to move as you think." He thought, "There are two of us now. Properly two. Whatever you bring at us, there are two of us." Outside, in the fading spring light, the north fields stood green and heavy, with the promise of a season that had not yet finished telling them what it had to give. Fence line ran clean to the horizon. The cattle moved slow and purposeful in the corral. And somewhere near the barn, a large and entirely unmanageable animal that had been named Fool in a moment of fondness stood watching the house with its characteristic air of supervisory confidence, unbothered by anything the world had to offer. Kettle began to sing. Lenora poured 2 cups and set one in front of him without asking, the way she'd done on the first morning, the way she would keep doing, the way that had stopped being a gesture and become simply the way things were. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He thought, this is what a beginning looks like. Not clean, not easy, not without Pelham at the edges and debt in the ledger, and a hard season only half finished and the long work still ahead of them. But real. Warm and specific and real, in a kitchen that 2 people had made into something worth coming home to. He thought, I came back here to bury something. He thought she was already building something new. He wrapped his hands around the cup, and he did not feel like a man at the end of something. He felt with the tentative and hard-won certainty of a person who has traveled a long distance to arrive exactly where they needed to be, like a man at the beginning of everything that actually mattered. Corbin came out on Tuesday as planned, which was something of a miracle, given that Corbin operated on a schedule that was more suggestion than fact. A habit the lawyer had developed over 20 years of circuit work that required him to be in 7 places at once, and had taught him that rigid timing was the enemy of thoroughness. He sat at the kitchen table with his papers spread out and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and listened to the situation regarding Pelham with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who has heard many versions of powerful people using legal complexity as a tool and has developed a specific and personal dislike for it. When Silas finished, Corbin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marriage solves it cleanly." "That's what I thought," Silas said. The in-between period, Pelham's lawyer is looking at the months between the presumed death declaration and your verified return creates a genuine ambiguity in a strict reading. Not one that would necessarily hold up, but one that a motivated attorney could keep alive in the courts long enough to cost you significantly. Corbin tapped the table. Joint marital title, backdated to the documented date of the marriage, eliminates the arguable period entirely. Property becomes jointly held. There's no competing claim because there's no separate party. "How soon can we do it legally?" Lenora asked. Corbin looked at her over his papers. "Courthouse in Harwick can process it in 3 days once I file the documentation," he said. "I'd suggest not waiting." "We're not planning to wait," she said. Corbin looked from her to Silas and back. Something moved across his face, not quiet, a smile. More the expression of a man who has seen enough of human difficulty to recognize something different when it sits across from him. "I'll file tomorrow," he said. He stayed for lunch, because Corbin always stayed for lunch wherever he went, which was one of the reasons people in the basin tolerated his irregular schedule. He was good company, and he ate without complaint whatever was put in front of him. And he told a story about a property dispute east of the Harwick circuit that involved a disputed fence line, 2 brothers who hadn't spoken in 11 years, and a pig of contested ownership that made Lenora laugh twice, which Silas marked as significant. After Corbin left, they went back to work because the season didn't pause for legal strategy. And there were things that needed doing in the north field before the afternoon heat made it unpleasant. They worked alongside each other in the way they'd been working for months, efficient, coordinated, occasionally disagreeing about method, resolving it and moving on. But there was something different in the day, not dramatic. Just a slight change in the air between them, the way a room feels different after a window has been opened, even if the temperature hasn't changed much. Something that had been held carefully was being set down. Something that had been possible was becoming actual. Lenora felt it and didn't comment on it. Silas felt it and didn't comment on it. They worked through the afternoon and came in when the light went long and gold across the fields, and she made supper and he fed the animals, and they sat at the table together in the familiar rhythm that had been building since October. "Are you afraid?" he asked over supper. She looked at him. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Good," he said. "Me too." She considered him. "That's supposed to be reassuring?" she said. "It means we're not idiots about it," he said. "Anyone who isn't afraid of this particular situation isn't paying attention." She thought about that. "That is slightly reassuring," she said. "Slightly." They married on a Friday in June. Not the Friday Corbin had initially projected, because Corbin had his schedule problems, and not in the courthouse in Harwick, because Lenora had looked at Silas 2 days before the planned courthouse date and said quietly that she'd married in a courthouse before, and it had felt like filing paperwork. And Silas had said they'd do it differently. They did it under the cottonwoods. There were 4 cottonwoods on the south edge of the property, old trees that had been there before Silas's parents had built the house, trees that made a loose canopy above the stretch of ground where Evelyn was buried. He had visited that grave alone again in the spring, on a morning in April when Lenora was in town, and stood there for a long time with no hat and no speech prepared, and eventually just said, "I think you'd have liked her." He didn't know if that was true. He hadn't known Evelyn and Lenora both well enough to know with certainty, but he believed it. Evelyn had been practical and unsentimental, and not much impressed by performance. And those were qualities she and Lenora shared in ways that made him think the observation was sound. Clara Hess came. She brought her husband, a quiet man named August, who had a handshake like a stone wall and said very little, and clearly meant every word of what he did say. Dearborn came with his wife and his characteristic tendency to grip hands slightly too long. The lawyer Corbin was there because he'd filed the papers and seemed to feel entitled to witness the results, which was fine. Corbin was good company. That was everyone. Lenora had no family within reasonable distance. She had a sister somewhere north, A woman she'd mentioned once in passing in a way that suggested the relationship was complicated and left at that. She did not seem troubled by the small number of witnesses. She stood under the cottonwoods in a dress she'd made herself dark blue, plain, well-made, the kind of garment a practical woman produces when she wants to look right without spending effort on looking elaborate. And she did not look like a woman performing a wedding. She looked like a woman making a decision she had thought through carefully and had arrived at honestly. Silas took from her in the only good coat he owned and looked at her face and thought that this was the correct version of this moment. Not grand, not decorated, just real. The justice of the peace from Harwick read the words. They said what needed to be said. Silas put a ring on her finger, a plain band he'd bought from the jeweler in town, because he'd asked her what she wanted, and she'd said plain and meant it, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, and then looked up at him with an expression he could read completely, and that was that. Clara cried. Corbin appeared to have something in his eye. Dearborn shook Silas's hand for what may have been a record duration. Lenora looked at August Hess, Clara's silent husband, who had maintained his composure throughout, and said, "Thank you for coming." And August said, "Wouldn't have missed it," and that was the warmest exchange of the afternoon. They walked back to the house. There was food, because Clara had brought enough to feed considerably more than 7 people, and they ate and talked, and it was ordinary in the best possible way. Ordinary in the way things are when they are simply right, and no one needs to make a production of it. After everyone left, Silas and Lenora stood on the porch in the early evening and looked at the property. The cottonwoods in the south moving slightly in the evening air, fields green and growing, the corral, the fence line running straight to the horizon. She was still wearing the ring. He could see her looking at it, occasionally, briefly, with the slightly surprised expression of someone getting used to a new fact. "Pelham is going to be annoyed," she said. "Yes," he said. "He's not going to give up," she said. "No," he said. "But he has less to work with now." She nodded. "One problem at a time," she said. "One problem at a time," he agreed. They stood there until the light was mostly gone, and then they went inside. The letter from Pelham's lawyer arrived 12 days after the wedding. It was exactly what Corbin had predicted, a formal inquiry into the title history, referencing the in-between period, requesting documentation of the current ownership claim. It was written in the careful, elaborate language lawyers use when they want to sound more powerful than they are, full of phrases that meant approximately the same thing repeated 3 times to give the impression of substance. Silas read it at the table and handed it to Lenora without comment. She read it. Her face did not change. She handed it back. "Corbin," she said. "Corbin," he agreed. He rode to Corbin's office that afternoon. Corbin read the letter with the unhurried attention he gave everything, then set it down and took his glasses off and cleaned them, which was a habit he had when he was constructing a response. "They're hoping you'll panic," Corbin said. "This isn't a strong filing. It's a fishing expedition with legal language on it. Most of its windows were dark. They want to see if you have the resources and the patience to respond properly, or whether you'll make the mistake of settling." "We're not settling," Silas said. "I know you're not," Corbin said. "I'm telling you what they want. Because understanding what your opponent wants is how you decide what to give them instead. What do we give them instead?" Corbin put his glasses back on. Complete title history, properly documented. The marriage certificate filed with the county, and a response that is so thorough and so clearly grounded in the actual legal record that continuing to pursue it cost them more than it could possibly return. He paused. "Pelham is a businessman. He's not going to fund a legal battle that has no realistic endpoint for him. His lawyer is looking for a crack in the wall. We give him a wall with no cracks. How long does that take?" 2 weeks, Corbin said. 3 at the outside. "And the cost?" Corbin named a number. It was not small, but it was survivable, particularly against what a prolonged legal fight would cost if they let the ambiguity stand. "Do it," Silas said. He rode back to the ranch and told Lenora. She listened, asked 2 specific questions about the documentation process, received the answers, and said, "All right." Then she went back to what she'd been doing. That was how they moved through things. Quickly, practically, without elaborate discussion of how they felt about the problem that conversation could happen later, after the problem was addressed. Neither of them had the temperament for lengthy deliberation over something that had already been decided. The summer pressed on. Corbin filed a response in the third week of June. It was, by all accounts, exhaustive, a title history going back to the original deed, documentation of every relevant legal action, a clear and airtight account of the current ownership that left nothing arguable. Pelham's lawyer went quiet for 2 weeks and then sent a brief acknowledgement that contained, reading between the lines, the legal equivalent of a retreat with maintained dignity. They did not hear from Pelham directly. Silas suspected they would not hear from him again for some time, which did not mean the man had abandoned his interest in the eastern acreage. Men like Pelham did not abandon interests. They deferred them, but it meant the pressure had lifted for now, and for now was what they had to work with. What they had to work with was the season, and the season was giving them something to work with. The north field, under the redirected irrigation, Lenora had proposed and Silas had agreed to try, came in stronger than either of them had projected from the conservative estimates they'd given Briggs. The wheat was good. Not exceptional, there was that dry spell in June that had put everything back 2 weeks, and cost them some of the upper field yield, but consistently good, the kind of crop that holds its value because it's reliable, and reliable was what a bank needed to see. Cattle were healthy across the board. The 2 calves born in spring had grown well. Fool, who was now a source of both pride and logistical inconvenience, had the particular quality of a good animal, solid, calm, with the kind of bone structure that suggested the next generation of this herd could be something to build on. Lenora ran the numbers in late July. She did it the way she always did at the kitchen table early morning, with the ledger open and her pencil moving and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, because she forgot to drink it when she was calculating. Silas had learned not to interrupt this process. He made his own coffee and did other things and waited. She looked up when she was done. "The July payment is covered," she said, "with enough left over to carry us comfortably into August." He looked at her. "Comfortably," he repeated. "The north field," she said. She almost smiled. Almost, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "There's still the October payment," she said, "and the final payment in the spring. Those are larger. But if the fall market holds," "It'll hold," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But if we run this place right through August and September, we'll be positioned. That's all we can do." She nodded. She looked at the ledger. "We're closer than we've been," she said quietly. "We are," he said. She closed the ledger and finally remembered her coffee, which was cold. She drank it anyway, because she was not a woman who wasted things, and Silas, watching her do this for the 100th time, felt the particular and peculiar warmth of knowing a person's small habits well enough to find them dear. August Hess, Clara's quiet husband, came out to the ranch on a Tuesday in late July with a work proposition that surprised Silas more than he expected. Hess ran a small freight operation, 3 wagons, reliable routes between the basin towns and the larger depot at Harwick. He had a regular cattle transport contract with a rancher south of Redwillow who was, as of this summer, relocating and terminating the contract. He needed a rancher in the basin who could handle reliable consignment and had quality animals. He sat at the table the way he did everything directly, without preamble. "I've seen your stock," he said to Silas. "I've been watching since spring. The bull you have is quality. Your cows are sound. 2 spring calves look right." He paused, the large one. "Fools," Silas said. Hess looked at him briefly. "The large one," he continued, "is going to be something. What breed is behind that animal?" "She bought the bull from a rancher in the south who ran Hereford Cross," Lenora said. 3/4 Hereford, near as we can tell." Hess nodded. "Good bone. Good temperament from what I've seen." "Reasonable temperament," Silas said, "when he decides to cooperate." "Best kind," Hess said. "A bull that's too easy doesn't put anything into the next generation." He laid out the proposition. A consignment arrangement, Redwillow would commit a specified number of animals per quarter for Hess's transport contracts to the Harwick market at a price set slightly above basin average in exchange for the reliability guarantee. Hess needed predictable supply. Silas and Lenora needed predictable income on top of the crop yield. They talked it through for an hour. Silas pushed on the price. Lenora pushed on the contract terms. She wanted a clause that allowed them to withhold animals in the event of a breeding season that required keeping the herd stronger without penalty. Hess, who had been doing business for 20 years and recognized the difference between people protecting themselves reasonably and people trying to take advantage, agreed to the breeding clause and met Silas partway on the price. They shook hands at the table. After Hess left, Lenora looked at the numbers again. Consignment, she said slowly, the October payment isn't close anymore. No, Silas agreed. It's manageable, she said. Better than manageable, he said. She looked at him. Hess trusts us, she said. He wouldn't have come out here if he didn't trust what we're building. Clara told him to come, Silas said. Clara told him to look, Lenora said. Came because he liked what he saw. She paused. There's a difference. Clara gives the introduction. What we've built is what made him stay at the table. He looked at her. She was right about that distinction, and she'd made it because it mattered to her not for pride. He understood now, but because she had spent too much of her life having her contributions absorbed into someone else's credit to be casual about the source of things. She needed the accounting to be accurate. Not in her favor accurate. Those were different things, and she understood the difference better than most. He said, what we've built. She nodded once, satisfied with the accuracy, and went back to the ledger. The October payment was made on the 2nd of the month, not the 14th, not after a series of late nights running numbers and hoping on the 2nd. 12 days early. Silas went to the bank himself and placed the payment on Briggs's desk and watched the man record it in his ledger with the unhurried precision that was Briggs's signature approach to everything. Briggs set down his pen. You're ahead of schedule, he said. Yes, Silas said. Briggs looked at him for a moment. Something in the man's permanently unimpressed face that was not quite warmth, but was its nearest neighbor. The arrangement you have out there appears to be working, he said. It does, Silas agreed. I had doubts, Briggs said. Not as an apology, just as a statement of record. I know, Silas said. I was wrong to have them, Briggs said, which from Harlan Briggs was the equivalent of a significant speech. Silas picked up his hat from the desk. We'll see you in the spring, he said. For the final payment, Briggs nodded once. He rode home in the October light with the receipt in his coat pocket and the particular feeling of a man who has made a bank payment early for the first time in a very long time, which is a specific and underrated satisfaction. He told Lenora when he came in. She was at the work table, working on the seed selection for next spring's rotation. She looked up when he said it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good, in the same tone she'd used back in April, when the extension had come through the tone of a woman checking something off a list. But hers were doing something else entirely, and he was close enough to her now to know that the eyes were the accurate report. One more, he said. One more, she said. She went back to her seeds. He put the receipt in the ledger in the back where they kept the paid documents. Winter arrived again, and they were ready for it. This time there was no scramble, no calculating against a deadline, no sense of the ground shifting under their feet. They had enough wood, enough grain, enough hay put up, enough in the account to absorb the ordinary disasters a frontier winter delivers without any particular creativity. They were not prosperous, not by the standard of people like Pelham, who measured prosperity in hundreds of acres and multiple operations. But they were solid. They had made something solid, and they both knew it, and the knowledge sat in the house like a banked fire, not dramatic, just warm and present and reliable. Silas's leg had improved through the summer, to the point where the limp was mostly only noticeable at the end of a very long day, or when the cold went deep and persistent. He did not use the walking stick anymore, except in the worst of the winter ice, which he did without comment, and Lenora observed without comment, which was the system they had developed for managing the things about each other they could not fix. She had her own things. The nights when she woke at 2 in the morning and could not find her way back to sleep, and would get up and sit by the fire with her hands around a cup of something warm and look at nothing in particular. He had learned to leave her to it. Not from indifference, from the understanding that some things a person works through alone, and the most respectful thing you can do is not make your presence into a demand for them to explain themselves. He understood the 2 in the morning thing. He had his own version of it. What they had built, the two of them, was not the smooth and easy life of people who found each other young and simple. It was something with history in it, with grief in it, with the particular weight of people who have survived things that left marks. That was not a flaw in what they had. It was the material it was made of. and material with history in it, if it's been properly worked, is stronger than the untested kind. December brought a letter from Lenora's sister. It had been forwarded twice, found her, which suggested the sister her name was Ruth had been trying to reach her for some time without knowing where she'd ended up. The letter was brief, written in a handwriting that was similar to Lenora's but less careful, as if the writer had less patience for the precision of it. Ruth had heard Lenora was married, wanted to know if it was true, wanted to know, more to the point, if she was well. Lenora read the letter at the table and held it for a while. Silas watched her face and waited. "She wants to know if I'm well," Lenora said. "What are you going to tell her?" Lenora looked at the letter. "I'm going to tell her yes," she said. "Then, after a moment, I'm going to invite her to visit." Silas looked at her. "In the spring," she said, "when the worst of the road is past." "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You don't mind?" "She's your sister," he said. "Of course I don't mind. We've never discussed." "Lenora," he said, with the calm patience he developed for the moments when she checked the structure of things she didn't need to check. "She's your sister. Invite her." She looked at him for a moment, something in her face that was still slightly unused to not having to justify herself. "All right," she said. She wrote the letter that evening. Silas read over her shoulder once, when he walked past, and she let him, which was its own small thing. Letting someone read the words you write to people you are complicated about is a kind of trust that does not come easily. The letter was warm. Not florid, not overwritten warm. In the plain way Lenora was warm, which was specific and genuine, and took some knowing to recognize, but was unmistakable once you did. She mailed it at the end of the week. Spring came again. The second one since Silas had ridden back into Redwillow Basin on a bad leg with a borrowed bedroll and nothing else. It came with the same gradual insistence, the green at the creek edges and the softening mud and the particular quality of the light that is different in March than in February, even when the temperature hasn't changed much. Silas noticed it the way he always noticed it now, through Lenora's eyes first, watching her read the land in the morning from the porch, and then through his own. They had a planting. They had a plan for the spring that was more ambitious than anything they'd attempted in the previous season. The Hess consignment had performed well through the winter, better than projected, because Hess had extended the contract without being asked, which was his way of saying he was satisfied. Most of its windows were dark. The additional income had allowed them to put more into the seed purchase and to make a decision about the North Field that they'd been considering since fall. They were going to break new ground on the North Field's unused eastern stretch. It was a significant commitment of labor. The ground had not been worked and would resist it, and Silas's leg was better but not entirely what it had been, and the work would require both of them and probably some hired help for the initial breaking. But the projection based on Lenora's soil assessment and Silas's knowledge of what that type of ground produced when it was properly opened was sound. If they did it right, that acreage would add meaningfully to their yield for years. They hired 2 men from town for the hard initial breaking brothers named Crane, young and strong and willing to work for fair wages without much conversation, which suited everyone fine. They worked alongside Silas and Lenora for 2 weeks in early April, and the ground came up the way good ground does when it is finally given the chance to be useful. Lenora had a particular way of working alongside men who expected to work harder than her. She didn't announce anything. She just worked steadily and continuously with the efficient physical competence she brought to everything, and after about half a day the men stopped expecting anything and simply worked beside her, which was where she'd been all along. The younger Crane brother said, near the end of the second week, while they were packing up in the evening, "That's the most land I've seen a woman break in a season." He said it with genuine respect, not condescension, and Lenora looked at him and said, "It'll break more next year." And the young man nodded seriously and seemed to take that as the promise it was. The final bank payment was due on a Thursday in late April. Silas had been watching the account for 3 weeks. The number was there. Had been there since the first week of April, sitting in the account with a stability that still felt slightly unreal to him, the way things feel when you've expected them to be precarious for long enough that security becomes unfamiliar. He did not go alone. He and Lenora rode into Redwillow together on the Thursday morning in a sky that was high and clear and so deeply blue it looked painted. Not dramatic weather, just a good day, The kind that doesn't mean anything except that it exists and you're in it. Briggs was at his desk. He stood when they came in, which was not something he normally did, and Silas understood that as Briggs's version of a significant gesture. Silas placed the payment on the desk. Briggs counted it with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything. Set it aside, opened his ledger, made his entry, blotted the ink. He turned the ledger to face them. The entry read, Crowther, Redwillow Ranch note paid in full. Lenora looked at it. Silas looked at it. Briggs picked up a form from a drawer and completed it and stamped it with the bank's seal and signed it and passed it across the desk. Deed of release, he said. Redwillow Ranch is free of the bank's interest as of today. Silas took it. He looked at it for a moment. He passed it to Lenora. She took it in both hands and read it, top to bottom, with the careful attention she gave documents. Her face was composed. Her hands were steady. She looked up from the paper. She looked at him. He looked at her. Briggs was watching them with the expression of a man who has had a long career of watching people at the end of difficult roads and has not entirely lost the capacity to find it meaningful. Congratulations, Briggs said, which may have been the warmest word Silas had ever heard him use. They walked out of the bank into the blue April morning. They stood on the main street of Redwillow with the deed of release in Lenora's hands and the spring light on everything and the ordinary life of the town moving around them. That's it, Silas said. That's it, she said. She looked at the paper again. She folded it carefully with the precision of a woman who understands the weight of documents and put it inside her coat, close to her body. He looked at her. Are you all right? He said. She thought about it. I've been working toward this for almost 3 years, she said. 2 without you and 1 with. And I knew it was coming. We both knew it was coming. But she stopped, looked at the street, looked back at him. I didn't let myself believe it completely until I was holding that paper. He understood that. He understood it in the specific way of a person who has also learned not to count on things until they are actually in your hands. It's in your hands, he said. She looked at him. And then she did something he had not seen her do before, not fully, not without the quick self-correction she usually applied. She let herself feel it. Not privately, not in the 2 a.m. way she managed her interior life alone, but right there on the main street of Redwillow with him watching. Her eyes went bright, and she pressed her mouth together for a moment, and he could see exactly what was moving through her, and he did not look away. She got it under control. Quickly, she was herself, and she was not a woman who stayed uncontrolled for long. But he had seen it. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just put his hand around hers, the hand that was holding the folded deed inside her coat. She let him. They stood there for a moment on the street. Then she said, We should get back. The south field needs checking before afternoon. Yes, he said. They rode home. Ruth came in May. She was shorter than Lenora, and louder, and had an opinion about everything she encountered, which she expressed without much apparent filtering. She was also, it became clear, within about an hour of her arrival, someone who loved her sister in the specifically exasperated way of a person who has spent years worrying about someone they couldn't keep track of. She looked at the ranch with sharp eyes. She looked at Silas with sharper ones. He let her look. He had nothing to hide, and he understood what she was doing. She was deciding whether her sister was all right. That was a legitimate project, and he respected it. On the second evening, while Lenora was in the barn doing the evening feed, Ruth sat down across from Silas at the kitchen table with a directness that reminded him very strongly of her sister. She looks better than I've seen her in years, Ruth said. Good, he said. I mean physically, but I also mean the other thing, Ruth said. The way a person looks when they've stopped waiting for the floor to drop out. Silas was quiet for a moment. She's been waiting for that for a long time, he said. Her whole life, near as I can tell, Ruth said. Every time something good happened, she held it at arm's length, like she was afraid of it. I know, he said. Ruth studied him. She trusts you, she said. Not as a compliment, as an observation, measured and specific. I know, he said again. I don't take that lightly. Ruth looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up her coffee. Good, she said, in a tone so similar to her sister's that he almost laughed. Lenora came in from the barn and looked at them both at the table. What are you talking about? She said. Weather, Ruth said. Lenora looked at her sister, then at Silas. She said, and went to wash her hands. Ruth stayed 2 weeks. She helped where she could and was honest about where she couldn't, which was a quality Silas appreciated. On her last morning, she and Lenora stood by the gate in the early light and talked quietly for a long time, and Silas stayed in the barn and gave them the space. When Ruth's wagon was gone down the road, Lenora came back to the house. She didn't say much about the conversation. She said, "She's going to come again in the fall, if the road is good." And then, I forgot how much She stopped. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You say that a lot," she said. "Because most of the time it's true," he said. She almost smiled, then actually smiled. The full version, which he was still not entirely accustomed to, still found slightly remarkable in the way a person finds remarkable the things they weren't sure they'd get. "Come look at the north field with me," she said. "The new ground is doing something interesting." He followed her out. The years that followed were not without difficulty. This is the part of a story that people sometimes want to skip the part after the crisis is resolved, the debt paid, the legal threat defeated, the marriage made. They want to believe that the resolution is the ending, that once the hard part is done, the rest is simply peace. It is not simply peace. Redwillow Ranch had 2 very bad seasons in the decade after the note was paid, one drought year, where the north field produced almost nothing, and they had to draw down savings they'd built carefully over 3 years, and one winter where they lost 2 cattle to something that spread through the herd, fast and cost them, before they understood what it was. Those years were hard in the bone deep, way hard seasons are. They argued more in those years. They lost sleep. There were nights where the pressure got the space between them and made it sharp. But they had learned by then how to move through the sharp parts without doing permanent damage. They had learned each other's specific ways of being frightened and the specific ways they each needed to be met in those moments. Silas needed to be left alone to work through his first panic response. He'd come to the other side of it on his own if she gave him room. Lenora needed to be asked a direct question, something practical, something that moved her from feeling to doing, because doing was where she found her equilibrium. Once he understood this, he stopped trying to comfort her in the abstract and started asking, "What do we do first?" And she would answer, and the answering was its own kind of steadying. They were not a perfect marriage. They were a working one, which is better. He never stopped noticing the things she did that he hadn't asked her to do. The careful maintenance of small things, the oiled hinges, the clean water channel, the way she tracked the animal's health in the ledger with the same consistency she'd kept through 22 months of managing the ranch alone. These were not romantic gestures. They're the gestures of a person who took the ongoing work of preserving something seriously, which was, to his mind, the most honest form of love, not the declaration, but the daily showing up. She noticed things about him, too, though she expressed it differently. She noticed when he was in pain and adjusted without drawing attention to it. She noticed when he was missing Evelyn, which happened. Still, in the particular way grief persists not as a constant ache, but as an occasional and specific absence, triggered by small things, and she did not compete with it. She had put flowers on that grave before she ever met him, and she kept putting them there, and that said something that neither of them ever needed to say out loud. 7 years after Silas rode back into Redwillow Basin on a broken leg and a dead man's reputation, a young widow came to their door. Her name was Pearl Hensley. She was 26, with 2 children under 5, and a property she was about to lose because her husband had died of fever in August. And the note was in his name, and the bank was not inclined toward patience. She had heard from someone who had heard from someone that the people at Redwillow might know what to do, might be willing to help. She stood on the porch in November with her hat in her hands and her children behind her, and explained her situation with the flat, exhausted clarity of a person who has said a difficult thing so many times that the emotion has been compressed down to just the facts. Silas and Lenora listened. When she was done, Lenora said, "Come inside." Not warmly, not coldly in the direct practical way. She said things that were simply the right thing to do. They fed the children. They sat with Pearl at the kitchen table and talked through the actual situation, the specific numbers, the specific bank, what was actually possible and what wasn't. They did not tell her everything would be fine. They told her what the options were and which ones were worth pursuing and which ones would cost more than they returned. At the end of the evening, Silas said, "We can help with the bank payment. Not indefinitely, but enough to buy you time to find your footing. Pearl looked at him. Why? She said. The same way Silas had said it to Lenora years ago. Just a question. Looking for the real answer. Lenora looked at him. He looked at Lenora. They had talked about this, not this specific moment, but this kind of moment. The kind that they'd both known would come eventually. The kind that a particular history makes inevitable. Because someone did it for us, he said, and someone did it for her, years before that. And the only thing that was ever asked in return was that someday, when you're able, you do the same. Pearl looked at them for a long moment. I don't know when I'll be able, she said. That's all right, Lenora said. That's how it works. Pearl Hensley kept her property. It took 2 years, and the help was not without its complications. The bank was not immediately cooperative, and there was a period in the winter of the first year where things looked genuinely uncertain, but she kept it. She was a determined woman, it turned out, which should not have surprised anyone and did not surprise Silas and Lenora. She came back, 5 years later, with a surplus season behind her and a payment she placed on their table. Lenora looked at it. You don't owe us this, she said. I know, Pearl said, but I'm giving it anyway, and you can't talk me out of it. Lenora looked at her for a moment. No, she said. I don't suppose I can. Pearl Hensley was not the last person who came to the Redwillow porch with a difficult situation and nowhere else to go. She was the first. They became known for it quietly, not by advertisement, but by the particular reputation that builds in a community when people notice that a specific place treats desperate people with practical dignity and asks nothing in return. Silas did not always fully understand how the reach of it worked. He knew the original act the morning in Tenshaw, long ago, when he'd paid a debt for a woman he didn't know and asked only that she pass it forward. He had done that once and forgotten it. She had done it for years and never forgotten it. And now they were doing it together, and now they helped, were presumably doing it somewhere in their own lives in ways Silas and Lenora would never know about. That was the part he found most human about it. Not the grand ledger of it, not the sense of a cycle completing just the ordinary fact that a thing done without a plan for recognition, without any expectation of return, could travel forward through other people's lives for decades in forms you'd never see. He thought about this one evening in October when the cottonwoods on the south edge of the property were turning gold and the light was the particular amber of a high basin autumn. He was sitting on the porch, which he did now in the evenings when the work was done, because the evenings were no longer something to get through. They were something to be in. Lenora came out and sat beside him. She had the ledger because she was always working, but she set it down on the railing and looked at the trees. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't need to be filled, that exists between people who have been in enough silences together to know the difference between the ones that are empty and the ones that are full. I've been thinking, Lenora said. About what? About what you said to Pearl, about how it works. He waited. I spent a long time, she said slowly, believing that you survived by not needing anyone, by being self-sufficient, by never... She paused. Never depending on anything you couldn't control yourself. I know, he said. I was wrong about that, she said. Came out plainly, without drama, the way she said things she had thought through fully. Not entirely wrong, you do have to be able to take care of yourself. But the reason you take care of yourself is so you're able to take care of other things when the time comes. Not so you never need anything. Just so you're not empty when something else does. He looked at her. That's better than anything I'd have come up with, he said. I know, she said. He looked at the cottonwoods. The thing I've been thinking, he said, is that I came back here expecting a grave and I found a life. And the life I found was built by someone I didn't know from a kindness I'd forgotten. He paused. There's something in that I can't entirely explain. Something about how the things you do when no one is watching are the things that last. Lenora was quiet. You did one thing, she said. On one morning, you forgot about it. Yes, I did 2 years of things, she said. On a lot of mornings. Yes, neither of us was planning anything, she said. Neither of us expected anything. No, he said. That's probably why it worked. She picked up the ledger, looked at it, set it down again. Do you think Evelyn would have liked this? She said. What we've made here. He had thought about this. He had thought about it on the morning Hunt stood at the grave and said he believed she would. And he had thought about it on many mornings since, with more evidence to work from. Yes, he said. She would have liked you specifically. She had no patience for people who made a fuss about themselves, and you are constitutionally incapable of making a fuss. Lenora looked at him. That's a compliment, he said. I know it is, she said. The light went slow and gold across the south field. The cattle moved in the corral. Somewhere in the barn, an aging animal that had been named Fool on a cold night years ago was probably standing in a doorway being an inconvenience to someone, and Silas felt the warmth of that thought in the way only a person who has had a long association with something improbable and beloved can feel. He thought, I came back here to end something. He thought she was already beginning something. He thought, the difference between a person who ends things and a person who begins them is sometimes just a matter of who gets there first and what they do with what they find. Lenora Crowther had found a dead man's land and decided it was worth saving. She had found a dead man's past and decided it was worth honoring. She had found, eventually, a not quite dead man limping up a dirt track with nothing and decided he was worth staying for. He would spend the rest of his life not taking that for granted. The evening went on. The cottonwoods held their gold. The ranch breathed around them, steady and real, the way things are when they have been built honestly by people who showed up every day for the work. Not perfect, never perfect, but theirs, completely irrevocably, finally theirs.